There is a city in Ontario that has been continuously inhabited for over 10,000 years, not by the civilization that built it, and not by the people who live there now, but by something older, something that the modern streets and glass towers and coffee shops and transit maps have been quietly built on top of, layer by layer, the way paint gets added to a wall until no one remembers the original color underneath. The streets exist, the buildings exist. The people rushing to work every morning with their headphones in and their coffee going cold in their hands, they exist. But beneath the concrete, beneath the utility lines and the subway tunnels and the buried rivers that used to flow freely across this land, there is stone, very old stone. Stone that was moved and shaped and arranged by someone. And the question of who that someone was, and when, and why, has been sitting in the dark beneath Canadian cities for a very long time, waiting for someone to look closely enough to ask it properly. This is not a story about Vikings. It is not a story about Celts or Egyptians or any of the other familiar cast of alternative history that shows up in these conversations, though we will mention them because fairness demands it. This is a story about the ground under your feet, if you live anywhere in the vast territory that became Canada, and about what was happening on that ground before anyone thought to write anything down, before agriculture reached the northern latitudes, before the first European ships crested the horizon and the sailors aboard them wrote home with trembling hands about the strangeness of this land. The strangeness was real, but it was not new. It had been here for a very long time. Geology does not lie. It moves slowly. It compresses information into strata that take patience to read, but it does not lie. And the geological record in several locations across Canada contains formations that look, to the careful observer, like they should not be there. Not formations in the sense of dramatic cliff faces or unusual mineral deposits, but formations in the sense of stone arrangements, structures, alignments, anomalies that sit at the intersection of the natural and the deliberate, in that uncomfortable borderland where mainstream archaeology tends to look away and alternative theorists tend to look too hard in the wrong direction, and the truth, if there is one, gets lost somewhere in the middle. If you are listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I check the comments, and there is something that moves me every time. Someone in Whitehorse at midnight, someone in Halifax just after the news, someone in Toronto lying in the dark listening to a story about the ground beneath their city. We are all just people in the dark, trying to understand what was here before us. The summer of 1954 was dry in central Ontario. The Trent River ran lower than usual that season, and the limestone outcrops along its valley sat exposed in the long afternoon light in ways that they were not always visible. A Curve Lake First Nation elder named James Wetung had known about the rock carvings on a particular hilltop near the town of Peterborough for as long as he could remember, because his people had known about them for as long as anyone in his community could remember, which was a very long time. The carvings were not a secret, not in the way that archaeological discoveries are sometimes secrets kept by a handful of specialists. They were known, lived with, revered, woven into the oral traditions of the Anishinaabe people in that region in ways that gave them context and meaning within an existing cosmological framework. But in 1954, a non-Indigenous geologist named Kenneth Kidd made the trip to the site, crouched over the pale limestone, and wrote in his field notes something that would become one of the most contested sentences in Canadian archaeological literature. He wrote that the carvings appeared to be, in his estimation, the most significant petroglyphic site yet recorded in Canada. He did not say who made them. He was careful about that, careful in the way that scientists learn to be when the evidence is not pointing where the existing frameworks say it should be pointing. He did not say how old they were. Dating rock surface carvings is notoriously difficult, and the conservative estimate for the Peterborough petroglyphs, which is what this site came to be called officially, settled eventually on a range of 500 to 1,000 years ago, a range that places them squarely within the period of Anishinaabe cultural production in the region, which is entirely reasonable. Except that some of the symbols carved into that limestone do not look like anything in the established iconographic vocabulary of Anishinaabe art. They look, to researchers who have spent time comparing them, like something else entirely, something that should not be in central Ontario at any time in the accepted historical record. And this is where the story begins to get complicated in the way that genuine mysteries do. not with a dramatic reveal, but with a slow accumulation of details that resist easy explanation, details that keep suggesting, without ever quite proving, that the story of who was on this land and when and what they were doing here is significantly older and stranger than the textbooks have been willing to admit. The Peterborough petroglyph site sits on a shelf of crystalline limestone in Northumberland County, about 45 kilometres northeast of the city of Peterborough proper. There are approximately 900 individual carvings on the main rock surface, which measures roughly 30 metres by 18 metres, and the site contains one of the most diverse collections of petroglyphic imagery found anywhere in eastern North America. Boats, animals, human figures, shamanic imagery, solar symbols, spirals, geometric patterns, maps, or what appear to be maps, astronomical alignments, or what appear to be astronomical alignments. The sheer variety of the imagery is one of the things that has kept researchers returning to this site decade after decade, because variety in petroglyphic traditions usually indicates either a very long period of accumulation, meaning many different groups of people adding to the collection over centuries, or a single cultural tradition rich enough in symbolic vocabulary to produce that range, or something else entirely, something that does not fit cleanly into either of those categories. The researcher who pushed hardest on the something else entirely interpretation was Barry Fell, a Harvard marine biologist who became, in his later years, one of the most controversial figures in North American pre-Columbian studies. Fell looked at the Peterborough petroglyphs in the 1970s and argued, with the confident specificity that made him both influential and infuriating to professional archaeologists, that a significant portion of the carvings were not Anishinaabe in origin at all. He argued that some of the symbols were Ogham script, the ancient writing system of the Celts, and that others showed clear parallels with Phoenician and Iberian Punic writing traditions. He argued, in the book that made him famous and notorious in roughly equal measure, that European mariners had been visiting and indeed settling in North America thousands of years before Columbus, and that the Peterborough petroglyphs were among the evidence he would cite in support of that argument. The professional archaeological community's response was, to put it gently, skeptical. Fell was not an archaeologist. He was a biologist who had taught himself epigraphy, the study of inscriptions, and his critics argued that his pattern recognition was motivated by conclusion rather than evidence, that he was seeing Celtic script because he was looking for Celtic script, that the methodology he was using to identify ancient writing in rock carvings was so flexible that it could find ancient writing in almost anything. There is genuine substance to this criticism. Epigraphy conducted without rigorous methodology can become a kind of Rorschach test in which the researcher's preconceptions determine what the inkblots resolve into, and Fell's work has not survived the scrutiny of peer review in the mainstream academic literature. But here is the thing about the Peterborough petroglyphs that tends to get lost in the argument about whether Barry Fell was right or wrong. The carvings are there. The unusual symbols are there. The question of what some of them mean within any known North American indigenous iconographic tradition has not been answered satisfactorily by mainstream archaeologists either. Dismissing Fell's interpretation does not explain the symbols. It just removes one bad explanation and leaves the question open, and open questions have a way of persisting. The Anishinaabe name for the site is Kino-Margewapkong, which translates approximately as the rocks that teach, the teaching rocks. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a metaphor, or rather, it is both of those things in the way that the most important names tend to be. The oral traditions of the Curve Lake Ojibwe community describe the site as a place where spiritual instruction has occurred since time immemorial, a phrase that in indigenous legal and cultural traditions has a specific weight, meaning before living memory, before the memory of anyone alive or recently dead, before the chain of oral transmission can be followed back to a specific origin point. Time immemorial does not mean a few hundred years. It means the carvings have been there longer than the knowledge of who made them. There are crevices in the limestone at the Peterborough site that are associated in Anishinaabe tradition with spirit voices, places where the rock itself speaks if you listen in the right way at the right time. Archaeologists have noted that some of these crevices align with specific astronomical phenomena, with the position of the sun at solstices and equinoxes, with the rising of particular stars at particular seasons. Whether this alignment is intentional, whether the carvings were placed in relation to these astronomical events as part of a deliberate cosmological mapping project, or whether the alignment is coincidental, is one of those questions that the evidence refuses to answer cleanly. The site is oriented, the researchers agree on that much. What it is oriented toward, and by whom, and why, is where the agreement ends. What does not seem to be in dispute is that the limestone surface on which the carvings exist has been a place of human significance for far longer than the carvings themselves. The bedrock geology of the Trent Valley shows evidence of human presence going back to the immediate post-glacial period, which in this part of Ontario means approximately 10,000 years ago, when the Wisconsin glaciation retreated northward and left behind a landscape of raw limestone, scattered glacial erratics, and meltwater channels that would slowly become the rivers and lakes of modern Ontario. The people who moved into this landscape as the ice retreated were among the first humans to occupy Canadian territory, and they were not wandering through empty wilderness. They were reading a landscape that the ice had freshly written, and they were writing back in the ways that humans always do, with fire and stone and movement and memory. The carvings we can see at Peterborough may be the most recent layer of a much older palimpsest, a word that means a manuscript that has been scraped clean and written over again, while the original text still shows through the new ink. The limestone itself is the palimpsest. The most recent carvings are readable or semi-readable. The older layers of human meaning-making are still there, but they are harder to find, harder to date, and they are underground. In 2003, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted around the perimeter of the main carving surface detected anomalies in the bedrock below the visible site. The anomalies were consistent with cavities, specifically with a series of interconnected cavities running below the limestone shelf at a depth of between 2 and 4 meters. Some of these cavities appeared to be natural, formed by the dissolution of limestone in groundwater over millennia, which is a completely ordinary geological process in this region. But others, in the interpretation of the geophysicist who conducted the survey, appeared to be modified. Not dramatically modified, not tunneled in the way that a mine or a bunker would be tunneled, but shaped, adjusted, their natural form altered in ways that suggested deliberate activity. The survey results were never followed up with excavation. The Peterborough petroglyph site is now protected under the Ontario Heritage Act and is managed in consultation with the Curve Lake First Nation, and archaeological disturbance of the site requires a level of regulatory approval and community consultation that is entirely appropriate given the site's significance and the history of extractive, disrespectful archaeological practice at Indigenous sacred sites across North America. The fact that the subsurface anomalies have not been excavated is not, in itself, suspicious. It is actually an example of how heritage management should work, with restraint, with consultation, with an understanding that not every question needs to be answered by digging. But the anomalies remain, the data exists. And what the data suggests, without proving, is that the visible portion of the Peterborough site is the surface expression of something larger, something that extends downward into the bedrock in ways that have not been fully mapped or understood. What that something is, and when it was created, and by whom, those questions are still open. Meanwhile, about 250 kilometers to the southwest, beneath the streets of one of the most densely populated urban corridors in Canada, a different kind of anomaly has been accumulating documentation for the better part of a century. The Greater Toronto Area, which sprawls from Oshawa in the east to Hamilton in the west and north toward Barrie in a nearly continuous band of suburban development, was built on top of a landscape that was, at the end of the last ice age, one of the most geologically active and dramatically altered regions on the continent. The glacial retreat from this part of Ontario did not happen in a simple, linear way. The ice came and went in multiple phases, advancing and retreating over periods of centuries, and the landscape it left behind was correspondingly complicated, full of buried valleys, ancient lake beds, glacial spillways, and formations of glacially deposited sediment that contain, within them, evidence of the world as it existed before the ice arrived, and the world as it existed immediately after. The buried valleys of the Toronto region are reasonably well known to geologists and civil engineers, because they are a practical problem. When you are building a subway tunnel under a city and you encounter, at a depth of 30 meters, a valley that was carved by a river 40,000 years ago and subsequently filled with sand and clay and gravel, you have a construction problem that requires expensive solutions. The Yonge Street subway extension encountered buried valley material in multiple locations during its various phases of construction. The water mains and sewer lines that run beneath downtown Toronto have been rerouted more than once to avoid or navigate the unpredictable subsurface topography left by the retreating ice. Engineers and geologists in this city know the buried landscape the way surgeons know the interior of a body they operate on regularly, by feel, by the resistance of different materials to the probe, by experience accumulated over decades of cutting into the earth and finding things they did not expect. What they have found, and what is considerably less well known than the buried valleys, is a recurring category of anomaly that has been showing up in the geotechnical reports of Toronto construction projects since at least the 1920s. When subway construction began in earnest, and engineers started penetrating the glacial sediments to depths not previously reached. The anomaly is this, and it is strange enough that it deserves to be stated plainly before it is explained. In multiple locations across the old city of Toronto, at depths ranging from 8 to 20 meters below the current surface, within layers of sediment that the standard geological model says were deposited by glacial activity somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000 years ago, construction crews have encountered arranged stone, not boulders randomly deposited by glacial action, which is common and expected and has a well-understood mechanism. Arranged stone, in the sense of flat pieces of limestone, placed in patterns that bear a structural relationship to each other, the kind of relationship that results from deliberate placement rather than from the random motion of ice and water and gravity. The first documented instance of this appears in a 1924 engineering report from the construction of a section of the original University Avenue subway corridor. The report is clinical and dry in the way that engineering reports are required to be, but even within that prose register, a note of puzzlement is detectable. The report describes a layer of what the engineer terms anomalous lithic arrangement encountered at a depth of approximately 12 meters within stratum 4 of the sediment column. Stratum 4, in the geological model being used at the time, dated to the late Wisconsin glacial period, meaning that whatever was in stratum 4 had been deposited by or during the last ice age. The engineer noted the anomaly, flagged it for geological review, and the construction project continued. The review does not appear in any archive that has been systematically searched, which may mean that the review was conducted and found a satisfying explanation, or may mean that the review was never conducted, or may mean that it was conducted and the results were filed somewhere that subsequent researchers have not been able to locate. The 1924 report would have remained a footnote, possibly a forgotten one, if it had not been for a retired civil engineer named Douglas Mather, who spent much of the 1980s collecting and cross-referencing geotechnical reports from Toronto construction projects. Mather was not an archaeologist or an alternative historian. He was an engineer who had spent his career building things in Toronto, and he had developed, over decades, a detailed mental map of the subsurface of the city, a map built from the accumulated data of hundreds of projects. It was this map, this professional intimacy with what was under the streets, that made the anomalies visible to him in a way they had not been visible to the individual engineers who encountered them one at a time on individual job sites. Mather's analysis, circulated in a self-published monograph in 1987 that was printed in an edition of perhaps 200 copies and distributed largely to members of the Engineering Institute of Canada, identified what he called structural concordances at 9 separate locations across the Old City, sites where the subsurface data from different construction projects, conducted decades apart and with no awareness of each other, showed evidence of the same type of anomaly at roughly the same depth in the same type of sedimentary stratum. 9 locations, spread across a roughly triangular area bounded by what is now the waterfront to the south, Bloor Street to the north, and spanning from about Bathurst in the west to the Don River in the east. 9 locations where the glacial sediments of late Wisconsin age contained stone arrangements that the geological record, as standard models understand it, should not contain. Mather proposed no explanation. He was careful about that. careful in the way that engineers learn to be when the evidence is pointing somewhere that the professional framework cannot accommodate. He simply presented the concordances, noted that he could not account for them within any geological model he was aware of, and suggested that the anomalies deserved systematic investigation by specialists in quaternary geology and archaeological site survey. He retired the following year. The monograph circulated quietly for a while, and then stopped circulating, as self-published monographs tend to do, and Douglas Mather died in 1994, without having received any formal academic response to his analysis. His monograph exists in the Toronto Reference Library in a collection of rare local documents. It is catalogued under engineering history rather than archaeology. One researcher who located it in 2011, a graduate student in the University of Toronto's Department of Anthropology named Sarah Chen, wrote in her thesis notes that reading the Mather monograph was like finding a letter that had been waiting in the wrong mailbox for 20 years. She included a reference to it in a footnote of her master's thesis on pre-Columbian land use in the Lake Ontario watershed. The footnote generated no academic discussion. This is how these things work. Not with suppression, not with conspiracies or men in black arriving to confiscate evidence, just with the ordinary structural invisibility that comes from information appearing in the wrong format, in the wrong place at the wrong time. A retired engineer's self-published monograph is not a peer-reviewed article. It does not go through the gate that academic knowledge must pass through in order to be taken seriously, and so it sits in a library, correctly catalogued, publicly available, waiting for someone who knows to look for it. What would it mean if Mather was right? What would it mean if the stone arrangements he identified in 9 separate locations across what is now downtown Toronto are genuine? Meaning, if they represent deliberate construction rather than glacial accident. The implications depend entirely on when those arrangements were made. And this is where the geology becomes both the most important evidence and the most contested territory in this entire question, because the dating of subsurface features in glacial sediment is not a simple procedure, and the results of that dating, when they are obtained, are not always straightforward to interpret. The standard model of the deglaciation of southern Ontario places the retreat of the Wisconsin ice sheet from the Toronto area at approximately 12,600 years ago, give or take a few centuries. Before 12,600 years ago, this was a landscape under ice, and the standard model says that humans were not under the ice, or at least not in significant numbers, not in ways that left durable structural evidence. After 12,600 years ago, the land emerged from the retreating glaciers and was available for human habitation, and the archaeological record of the early post-glacial period in southern Ontario is sparse but real. Fluted projectile points associated with the Clovis and later cultural traditions, traces of the first people moving into a newly deglaciated landscape, still being shaped by meltwater and geological adjustment. But the standard model has been under sustained pressure for the last 30 years. The pressure comes from multiple directions simultaneously, which is what makes it interesting rather than simply controversial. It comes from archaeological sites in South America, particularly the Monte Verde site in Chile, which has been dated to at least 14,500 years ago and which sits well south of the point where the standard Bering Land Bridge crossing and ice-free corridor migration model says humans should have been at that time. It comes from genetic studies of indigenous North and South American populations that have been producing divergent states that push the initial peopling of the Americas significantly earlier than the Clovis model accommodates, toward 20,000 years ago or earlier. And it comes from a small but persistent body of underwater archaeological and geological evidence, suggesting that the coastlines of North America during the last ice age, when sea levels were dramatically lower than they are now, were home to human habitation that is now submerged beneath several meters of ocean. If the initial peopling of the Americas is older than the Clovis model, and the accumulating evidence suggests that it is, then the question of what humans were doing in the Toronto area during the Wisconsin glaciation becomes more complicated than the standard model allows. The ice covered most of what is now southern Ontario, yes, but the ice was not a uniform, static, impenetrable sheet. It had margins, and those margins shifted over centuries. It had refugia, ice-free or partially ice-free zones within its general extent, where different ecological conditions obtained and where, potentially, human groups could have survived. And it had a coastline, the margin of Lake Erie to the south, the edge of Lake Ontario, which, even during the glacial maximum, held water, though the form and extent of that water was very different from the lakes as they exist today. The people who were in this region before and during the glacial maximum, if there were people here then, would not have left the kind of archaeological signature we are accustomed to looking for. They would not have had cities in any recognizable sense. They would not have had agriculture. They would not have had pottery in the forms we associate with later North American cultures. What they might have had was stone, the same stone that underlies the Toronto Basin, the same limestone that surfaces at the Peterborough petroglyphs, the same durable material that survives glacial overriding and burial in sediment, and the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated earth. And this is where the Toronto anomalies and the Peterborough site begin to speak to each other across the 250 kilometers between them, not loudly, not conclusively, but in the quiet way of evidence that is pointing in the same direction without having agreed to do so. There is a formation beneath the city of Victoria, British Columbia, that has been known to the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of southern Vancouver Island for as long as their oral traditions reach, which is very long. The Songhees and Esquimalt nations, whose traditional territories encompass what is now the Greater Victoria metropolitan area, describe certain locations in their territory, particularly along the shoreline of the Inner Harbour and in the upland areas that are now parks and residential neighbourhoods, as places of unusual spiritual power, places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the world of spirit is thinner than elsewhere. This kind of description is common in indigenous spiritual traditions across many cultures, and it functions in multiple registers simultaneously, as genuine spiritual geography, as social memory of significant events, and often, when examined carefully, as encoded information about physical features of the landscape that have practical significance. In the case of the Lekwungen sites in Victoria, the practical significance that keeps appearing when researchers look closely is this. The locations described as spiritually significant tend to sit above or adjacent to anomalous geological features that show evidence of human modification, not dramatic modification, not obvious construction. Subtle modification, the kind that is easy to mistake for natural geological process until you have looked at enough natural geological formations in the same type of bedrock to know what the unmodified version looks like. The bedrock of southern Vancouver Island is primarily a complex of metamorphic and igneous rocks, primarily schist and greenstone, quite different from the sedimentary limestone of the Ontario examples. What this means for the detection of potential subsurface structures is that the formation of natural cavities and chambers in this bedrock is a different process, more related to tectonic fracturing and hydrothermal activity than to the dissolution of limestone in groundwater. Natural cavities in this type of bedrock are common, but they have a specific morphology, a specific set of structural characteristics, angles of fracture face, surface texture, the geometry of the cavity interior, that geologists who work in this type of formation learn to read as signatures of natural process. The anomalous cavities that have been identified in several locations across the Greater Victoria area do not have those signatures, or rather, they have them partially. They have some characteristics of natural tectonic fractures, while also having other characteristics that are more consistent with intentional modification, with the smoothing of surfaces, the regularizing of cavity dimensions, the creation of connections between naturally separate voids that would not form spontaneously through purely tectonic processes. The most extensively documented of these sites is in the upland area north of the Inner Harbour, in what is now a residential district that was developed primarily in the 1920s and 30s. During the excavation of foundations for several houses in this district during that period, workers encountered a series of interconnected underground chambers at depths ranging from 3 to 8 meters below the surface. The chambers were described by the workers in accounts that were collected by a local historian named Margaret Ormsby in the 1940s as smooth-walled, roughly rectangular in cross-section, and connected by passages too small for an adult to move through comfortably, but large enough for a person to traverse with difficulty. The chambers were dry when encountered, which is notable given the general hydrology of the Victoria area, which tends towards saturated soils and high water tables. The foundations were poured around and through the chambers, rather than into them in all cases, because the depth of the chambers was in some instances below the required foundation level, and the chambers were more structurally stable than the surrounding soil, meaning that they provided a better base for construction than the alternative. As a result, several houses in this district of Victoria sit, right now, on top of or beside underground chambers whose origin and age have never been formally investigated. The chambers are simply below the houses. They are known to the homeowners in the same vague way that many structural eccentricities of old houses are known, as features of the house's history that are mentioned when the house is sold, discussed over drinks with curious neighbours, and otherwise not thought about very much, because they have no practical relevance to the ordinary business of living. But they are there, and what they are, in terms of their origin and their age, remains an unanswered question. Margaret Ormsby, the historian who collected the accounts from the construction workers, was primarily interested in local history in the conventional sense, in the social and economic history of the Victoria area from the colonial period forward. She collected the accounts of the chambers as part of a general archive of local memory that she spent decades assembling, and she included them in a 1958 paper on the early development of Victoria's residential districts, with the same equanimity that she brought to accounts of unusual building materials or eccentric architectural choices. She did not speculate about their origin. She documented them, filed them, and moved on. The paper exists, the accounts exist, the chambers presumably still exist beneath houses that have changed hands many times since the 1920s, and no archaeologist has ever conducted a formal investigation of them to the knowledge of anyone who has looked into this question. This pattern of documentation without investigation, of anomalies being recorded but not pursued, is one of the more consistent features of this entire category of evidence, and it is worth pausing to think about why that pattern exists, because the answer is not as simple as institutional suppression or professional cowardice, though neither of those factors can be entirely discounted. The more fundamental reason is structural, built into the way that archaeological investigation works as a professional practice. Archaeology is an expensive, time-consuming discipline that operates within a framework of limited resources and competing priorities. A professional archaeologist who wants to investigate a potential site needs funding, which requires a grant application, which requires a preliminary case for significance, which requires some existing evidence that the site is worth investigating. The anomalous chambers beneath Victoria houses, the subsurface concordances in Toronto's glacial sediment, the unexplained carvings at Peterborough, these things are interesting, but they do not constitute a preliminary case for significance in the terms that archaeological funding bodies typically use to evaluate grant applications, because the categories in which they would need to be classified in order to be significant do not yet exist. You cannot write a convincing grant application for the investigation of pre-glacial human habitation in southern Ontario if the funding body's criteria are built around the assumption that there was no pre-glacial human habitation in southern Ontario. This is a real structural problem, and it is not unique to Canadian archaeology. It appears wherever evidence suggests that the existing chronological framework for human history in a region may be significantly wrong, because the framework itself determines what counts as evidence worth pursuing. The framework is not conspiratorial. It emerged from the best available evidence at the time it was established, and it continues to be supported by the majority of the evidence. But it is not immune to revision, and the history of archaeology is full of revisions that seemed impossible until they happened, and then seemed obvious once they had. The revision that seems most relevant to the Canadian evidence is the one that has been happening gradually and contentiously to the Clovis first model of the peopling of the Americas. For decades, the Clovis tradition, characterized by specific fluted stone projectile points, first found near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s, was considered the oldest evidence of human presence in the Americas, dated to approximately 13,000 years ago. The Clovis first model held that the ancestors of all Native American populations entered the continent from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge sometime around 14,000 years ago, and spread southward through an ice-free corridor between the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets. This model is now known to be wrong, at least in its strong form. The evidence for this is not ambiguous. The Monte Verde site in Chile, definitively dated to at least 14,500 years ago, predates Clovis and is located at the southern tip of South America, which the ice-free corridor model cannot easily accommodate. Genetic analyses of Native American populations consistently produce divergence dates that suggest an initial entry into the Americas of at least 20,000 years ago. Artifacts from sites in Texas, Virginia, and other locations have been dated to periods predating Clovis. The model has not been abandoned, but it has been substantially revised, and that revision is ongoing. What the revision of the Clovis first model does, among other things, is open a temporal window that was previously considered closed. If humans entered the Americas 20,000 years ago, or earlier, rather than 14,000 years ago, then the question of what they were doing during the intervening period of glacial maximum, when much of northern North America was under ice, becomes genuinely open in a way it was not when the Clovis dates were considered definitive. People were here. The ice was also here. How those two facts interacted, what human life looked like at the margins of the great ice sheets, is a question that the evidence is only beginning to address. There are two places in Canada where this question feels most urgent, most vivid, most pressing, and they are not the places you would expect. One of them is Churchill, Manitoba, on the southwestern shore of Hudson Bay. The other is the lower St. Lawrence Valley in Quebec, particularly the area around the city that the French called Quebec City when they established their settlement there in 1608, and which the people who were there before the French had been calling many different things for many thousands of years. Churchill is famous among wildlife tourists for polar bears, which congregate along the coast in October and November, waiting for Hudson Bay to freeze. It is famous among aurora watchers for the quality of its northern lights, unobstructed by the light pollution that makes aurora viewing difficult in more densely populated places. It is cold, it is remote. It sits at the end of the only rail line that connects it to the rest of Canada, a rail line that was built through the subarctic terrain at enormous expense and hardship in the 1920s to provide a northern export route for prairie grain. It is, in the conventional imagination, an edge-of-the-world kind of place, a frontier, a place where the human project is still new against the deep background of the Canadian North. But Churchill is not at the edge of history. It is at a very specific place in history, and that place is considerably more central to the story of human activity in North America than its current remoteness suggests. The area around Churchill was not always subarctic. During and immediately following the retreat of the Wisconsin glaciation, the Hudson Bay Basin was the site of one of the most dramatic hydrological events in post-glacial North America, the drainage of the great glacial lakes that had accumulated behind the retreating ice. When the ice margin retreated far enough north, the lakes that had been dammed by the ice found new outlets, and billions of liters of fresh water poured into the Hudson Bay Basin in geological timespans that were, by human standards, catastrophic, transformative events that happened over decades and centuries rather than millennia. This event, or series of events, is thought to be associated with significant disruptions in North Atlantic circulation patterns, climate shifts that may have contributed to cold periods recorded in the geological record around 8,000 years ago. The people who were living around the margins of Hudson Bay when this happened were the inheritors of a very long tradition of human presence in the region, people whose ancestors had been tracking the retreating glaciers northward for thousands of years, following the game that followed the tundra that followed the ice. And they knew this landscape in the intimate, encyclopedic way that people know a landscape they depend on for everything. What those people left behind at Churchill and its surrounding area has been studied intermittently since the 1940s, when archaeological surveys of the Churchill River drainage began in earnest. The surveys found what they expected to find: evidence of successive waves of Arctic-adapted cultures, the Denby Flint complex, the Dorset culture, the Thule culture that is ancestral to contemporary Inuit, the technologies and patterns of settlement left by people who had spent millennia perfecting the art of survival in one of Earth's most demanding environments. The surveys found what they expected, and that is what they reported. But there are anomalies in the Churchill area that do not fit neatly into the expected sequence. They have been noted, in passing, by various researchers over the decades, and they have not been adequately explained. The most significant of these anomalies is a series of stone features on the coastal limestone outcrops south of the Churchill River. Features that have been variously interpreted as hunting blinds, Inuk soot, ceremonial structures, and navigation markers by different researchers working at different times, and that resist definitive classification into any of those categories. What makes these features unusual is not their existence. Stone features are common along the Hudson Bay coast, but their depth. The features extend below the current ground surface by between 1 and 3 meters in multiple locations, meaning that their foundations are set into the rock rather than simply resting on its surface. This is unusual because the cultures with which the surface features are associated, Dorset and Thule, did not characteristically build stone structures with foundations. They built on surfaces, on rock faces and gravel beaches, using the stone of the landscape without significantly altering its form. The deep-founded features at Churchill are doing something different, something that implies a level of investment in permanence that is not characteristic of mobile Arctic cultures, a level of investment that implies either a culture with very different behavior patterns than Dorset or Thule, or a much earlier date, when the specific demands of survival in this region required different strategies. The alternative explanation, proposed cautiously in a 1991 report by a geological survey team working in the Churchill area, is that the features may predate the Dorset and Thule cultures, that they may belong to an earlier and less well-understood period of human occupation in the Hudson Bay region, a period for which the material cultural record is thin precisely because the conditions that would have produced it, a warmer, more resource-rich coastal environment, were subsequently altered by the climate shifts associated with the post-glacial hydrological events described above. A landscape that was once productive enough to support a settled or semi-settled population, making permanent stone structures, would have been transformed, over centuries, into the subarctic tundra of the current Churchill area, and the people adapted to the old landscape would have had to adapt to the new one or perish. The Geological Survey report from 1991 filed its observations under the heading of Anomalous Surface Features, recommended further investigation, and was subsequently used primarily as a resource for mineral extraction permitting in the area. The recommendation for further investigation went unimplemented. The features are still there, still deep-founded, still unclassified. Meanwhile, in Quebec, the story is different in its specific details, but similar in its essential character, the character of deep strangeness that has been built over and built around until the strangeness is almost invisible beneath the accumulated layers of the ordinary. Quebec City sits on a dramatic geographical feature, the Cape of the St. Lawrence Valley, where the river narrows dramatically between the Laurentian Highlands to the north and the Appalachian foothills to the south, and where a massive rock formation rises 300 meters above the river, providing what military planners throughout history have recognized as one of the most defensible positions in eastern North America. Samuel de Champlain recognized it. The Haudenosaunee recognized it long before him. The Algonquin peoples, who had been visiting and camping along this stretch of the St. Lawrence for thousands of years before Champlain's arrival, recognized it. The Huron-Wendat, who had a significant settlement in the area in the period immediately preceding French contact, recognized it. And before all of them, the people who were here before the peoples named above, the earlier inhabitants of the St. Lawrence Valley, whose material culture is less well represented in the archaeological record because they came earlier and left different kinds of traces, they recognized it too. The rock above the river is a feature of the landscape so obvious, so powerfully present, that it is difficult to imagine any human being moving through this valley over the last 10,000 years who did not look at it and feel its significance. The question is what they did with that significance. What the French did with it is well documented. They built a city on top of it. They built fortifications, churches, administrative buildings, residential neighborhoods, streets. They quarried the rock of the cape itself to build with, and in quarrying it, they created, over centuries, a network of passageways and chambers beneath the upper town that has been explored, partly, and that is open to tourists in some sections, and closed in others because sections of it are structurally unstable or have not been adequately surveyed. The passageways that tourists can visit beneath Old Quebec City are interesting. They have been present in various forms since the French colonial period, and they tell a story about French military engineering and urban development that is genuinely fascinating. But they are not the oldest things beneath the rock. The oldest things beneath the rock are older than Champlain, older than any French presence in the St. Lawrence Valley, older than any documented historical contact, and some of them are strange enough that the archaeologists who have encountered them have not been entirely certain what to make of them. Archaeological investigations beneath Quebec City have been conducted sporadically since the late 19th century, primarily in the context of construction and renovation projects, rather than systematic excavation for research purposes. The Old City is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which means that construction within its bounds requires archaeological monitoring, and that monitoring has produced, over the decades, an accumulating record of what is below the streets and buildings. Most of what that monitoring finds is exactly what you would expect: the material remains of successive periods of French and later British occupation, the artifacts and structural traces of a city that has been continuously inhabited for over 400 years. This is good archaeology, careful and thorough, and it has produced a rich and detailed picture of the colonial history of the site. But several investigations, conducted at greater depth than the typical colonial period site monitoring usually penetrates, have found things below the colonial layers that raise questions about the pre-colonial history of the site, specifically about how the natural rock of the Cape was modified and used in the period before French contact. The most significant of these investigations was conducted between 2006 and 2008 during the excavation for a new structure in the Lower Town area, an excavation that went significantly deeper than most colonial period work because the new structure required foundations at a depth that took the excavation below the earliest French occupation layers and into the geological substrate at a depth of approximately 6 meters below the current surface, which placed the excavation below any layer that could be associated with French colonial activity. The archaeologists found a series of modifications to the natural limestone that did not have an obvious explanation within the French colonial context. The modifications were, in the lead archaeologist's published description, a series of flat-bottom depressions cut into the bedrock surface, approximately half a meter in depth, arranged in a pattern that suggested either a drainage system or a series of prepared surfaces for some kind of construction activity, with connecting channels between the depressions that were too regular and too precisely cut to have formed naturally. The archaeologist who documented these features was careful in her language, noting that the features were consistent with pre-European occupation of the site, while acknowledging that without associated material culture, it was impossible to be certain of their origin. The material culture was not found, or at least not in quantities sufficient to provide a confident cultural attribution. A few lithic artifacts were recovered from the sediment that had accumulated in the depressions, artifacts that were not immediately recognizable as belonging to any specific cultural tradition, chipped stone objects that may have been tools or may have been debitage, the waste material of tool manufacture. Nothing that allowed a confident cultural or temporal attribution. The excavation was completed, the structure was built, and the features were documented in a technical report that was filed with Parks Canada and the Quebec City Municipal Government, where it remains available to researchers who know to look for it. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The features are now beneath the foundation of a building and inaccessible. This is, again, not sinister. Archaeological features get built over all the time in urban contexts, because cities do not stop functioning while archaeologists work. What is notable is the pattern. The same pattern appearing in different cities across Canada, features that predate known occupation but do not fit easily into any established cultural framework, documented but not investigated, filed and unavailable to the larger conversation about pre-Columbian history in North America. Now let us go to a place where the anomalies are not subterranean, but surface level, visible, mapped, and still unexplained. The Peace River Valley in northeastern British Columbia and northwestern Alberta is one of the least populated regions of Canada, and it is less populated in part because it is difficult terrain, a broad valley flanked by steep upland slopes, with a river that runs fast and cold, and that was before the construction of the WAC. Bennett Dam in 1967, subject to flooding patterns that made permanent settlement along its banks both hazardous and rewarding in alternating seasons. The indigenous peoples of the Peace River region, primarily the Dane Zar, also known as the Beaver people, and the Cree, have occupied this valley for thousands of years, adapting to the river's cycles and developing an intimate knowledge of its geography and ecology. The W.A.C. Bennett Dam created the Williston Lake Reservoir, which is one of the largest reservoirs in Canada by surface area, and the flooding of the valley behind the dam inundated a significant archaeological landscape that had never been systematically surveyed. This is a genuine loss, one that was documented and mourned by the archaeologists who were brought in for emergency salvage excavation in the years before the flooding. The salvage work found what was expected: archaeological sites associated with the historical indigenous cultures of the region, and more. It found anomalies. The anomalies in the Peace River Valley that were recorded during the salvage period but never fully investigated before the flooding, because there was not enough time and not enough resources to investigate everything, included several locations where the bedrock of the valley walls, the steep limestone and shale cliffs flanking the river, showed evidence of modification at heights that made no obvious functional sense in the context of known cultural practices. Carvings at heights of 10 to 15 meters above the pre-dam river level, in locations accessible only with ropes or scaffolding, in styles that did not match the documented rock art traditions of the Danzar or Cree. Arrangements of stones on ledges high on the valley walls, in positions that seemed to be oriented towards specific points on the horizon that corresponded, in some cases, to astronomical phenomena. Sunrise and sunset positions at solstices, the northern extent of the moon's monthly arc. The researcher who spent the most time documenting these features before the flooding was a provincial government archaeologist named Brian Molyneux, who wrote in his 1965 salvage report that the high-altitude features appeared to represent a cultural tradition distinct from those associated with the historical indigenous cultures of the region, and that this tradition appeared to be considerably older than the most ancient of the known cultural layers in the valley. He estimated, on the basis of the degree of natural weathering and the position of the features relative to dated sediment layers, that some of the features could be as old as 6,000 years. He noted that this estimate was necessarily tentative, given the absence of datable associated materials. 6,000 years ago, the Peace River Valley looked quite different from its current form. The climate was in a warmer phase, the so-called Holocene thermal maximum, which produced conditions in the northern boreal regions of Canada that were, in some respects, more temperate than the current climate. The valley would have been more productive, supporting denser populations of game animals and a broader range of plant resources than the current subboreal climate allows. It would have been, in short, a good place to live, and there is every reason to think that people did live here, have lived here, for a very long time. But the high-altitude features described by Molyneux do not look like the material culture of the period those people are known from. They look like something else, something that does not fit neatly into the established cultural sequence for the northern interior of British Columbia and Alberta. What they look like, to researchers who have studied them from Molyneux's photographs and measurements since the reservoir flooded the valley, is a tradition of astronomical marking that is more elaborate, more systematically organized, and more technically demanding than anything attributed to the Paleo-Indian cultures of this region. The reservoir is now more than 50 meters deep at its deepest points. The valley floor is underwater. The ledges and cliff faces that Molyneux documented are, in most cases, above the current waterline, still technically accessible, but the context in which they made sense, the valley floor, the river, the sediment layers that connected the high features to the low ones, that context is gone, drowned under the reservoir that provides power to a significant portion of British Columbia. The features exist. The photographs exist. The report exists. But the investigation that might have answered the questions they raise was never conducted, and now much of the information that would have made that investigation possible is underwater. This is not the only place in Canada where dam construction has permanently altered the archaeological record of potentially ancient human activity. The Churchill River in Manitoba, the Columbia River in British Columbia, the Ottawa River, the Winnipeg River, all of these waterways have been dammed at multiple points, and in each case, the flooding of the reservoir behind the dam has inundated archaeological landscapes that were not fully surveyed before the water rose. The cumulative effect of this hydroelectric development on the pre-Columbian archaeological record of Canada is significant, and it is largely invisible, because what has been lost is not a specific known site with a known cultural attribution, but the possibility of discovery, the the possibility of finding things that were there before the water covered them. What was there before the water covered it in the Peace River Valley, at least in part, was the evidence Molyneux described. And what he described suggests that the people who were in the northern interior of British Columbia and Alberta 6,000 years ago or more had a relationship with astronomical observation and monumental marking that is not adequately captured by the cultural frameworks we use to describe Paleo-Indian and Archaic period peoples in this region. This is the direction that the evidence consistently points when you look at the totality of the Canadian data, not toward any single dramatic revelation, not toward a specific lost civilization that can be named and mapped and placed on a timeline with confidence, but toward the conclusion that the story of human activity in the territory that became Canada is significantly older, significantly more complex, and significantly less well understood than the existing frameworks suggest. The frameworks are not wrong in what they include. They are incomplete in what they exclude, and what they exclude is the evidence that does not fit. The exclusion is not always deliberate. Sometimes it is structural, as described above, a result of the way that archaeological funding and professional recognition flow toward work that fits within existing frameworks, rather than work that challenges them. Sometimes it is a result of practical limitations, sites inundated by reservoirs, features built over by expanding cities, anomalies encountered in the course of construction and noted but not investigated because the construction could not wait for archaeology. And sometimes, less frequently but not negligibly, it reflects a genuine professional reluctance to engage with evidence that might require a fundamental revision of well-established models, because fundamental revisions are professionally costly and personally demanding, and they require the kind of courage that is easier to display in retrospect than in the moment when you are deciding whether to stake your reputation on a data set that does not yet constitute a decisive case. The Moose Jaw Tunnel System is a different kind of story. Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, is a city of approximately 35,000 people in the southern part of the province, a city that was built in the classic prairie tradition of the late 19th and early 20th centuries on the CPR main line as a service hub for the surrounding agricultural region. It has grain elevators and a racetrack and a tunnels of Moose Jaw tourist attraction that tells the story of an underground network of passages beneath the city that, the tourist narrative goes, were used by Chinese immigrants hiding from racist persecution in the early 20th century, and possibly also by Al Capone, depending on which version of the story you encounter. The Chinese immigrant tunnels narrative is largely fictional in its details, a local myth that has been thoroughly examined by historians and found to have no substantive documentary support. There were Chinese residents of Moose Jaw in the early 20th century who faced significant racism, but the specific story of the tunnels as a refuge network for persecuted immigrants does not hold up to historical scrutiny. The Al Capone connection is even less supported. Capone was occasionally in the West, occasionally in Canada, but there is no credible evidence that he was in Moose Jaw, or that the tunnels beneath the city played any role in Prohibition-era rum-running operations. What is real about the Moose Jaw tunnels is more interesting than the tourist narrative, and considerably more strange. There are passages beneath Moose Jaw. The city was built over a network of service tunnels that connected various buildings in the downtown core, allowing the movement of goods and utilities in the cold prairie winters without the need for surface travel. This is a common feature of prairie cities, where extended periods of extreme cold made underground connections practically useful, and it accounts for a significant portion of what the tourist attraction presents. But beneath those service tunnels, in multiple locations that have been identified by residents, utility workers, and local historians over the decades, there appear to be older passages. Older, not in the sense of early 20th century older, but older in the sense of significantly predating the establishment of Moose Jaw as a city, passages that are cut through a different type of geological material than the service tunnels that show weathering patterns inconsistent with a construction date in the colonial period, that contain in some cases sedimentary deposits of considerable age. The most detailed account of these deeper passages comes from a former utility worker named Ronald Clutterbuck, who spent 23 years working in the underground infrastructure of Moose Jaw and who, after his retirement in 2002, spent several years documenting what he had seen over the course of his career. His account, written up and circulated among local history enthusiasts, describes multiple instances of encountering, in the course of maintenance work in the service tunnel network, what he calls pre-existing passages that the service tunnels had been built alongside or on top of, passages that his professional experience told him were significantly older than anything he would expect to find in the underlying geology of a prairie city. Clutterbuck was not a geologist or an archaeologist. He was a utility worker with 2 decades of experience working in underground infrastructure, and his expertise was practical rather than academic. But practical expertise has value, and what Clutterbuck describes, the texture of the walls, the shape of the cross-sections, the way the passages connected to each other, sounds in his account quite different from the service tunnels that any 19th or 20th century engineering would have produced. He describes walls that were shaped rather than cut, rounded profiles that seem to have been created by a process of patient removal rather than by the sharp-edged excavation that a modern drill or pick produces. He describes chambers at intersections of passages that were too large to be utility chambers and too irregularly shaped to be storage spaces, chambers that felt, in his words, like rooms rather than infrastructure. Clutterbuck's account was dismissed by the City of Moose Jaw's Public Works Department as a misidentification of natural geological features, specifically the dissolution cavities that can form in some of the carbonate rock layers underlying the southern prairie. This is a plausible explanation for some of what he describes, particularly the rounded wall profiles and irregular shapes of some chambers. Dissolution cavities can produce passages and chambers that look, to the untrained eye, like they might be artificial. The explanation is reasonable as far as it goes. But Clutterbuck was not untrained. He had spent 2 decades distinguishing between natural geological features and artificial constructions in underground environments, and his account does not simply describe rounded passages and irregular chambers. It describes, with the specificity of someone who worked in built environments for his entire career, features that, in his estimation, could not be natural, features that were too regular in their larger organization, too clearly related to each other in their spatial layout, to have formed through random geological process. Clutterbuck died in 2012. His documentation was not formally archived, and its current location is unknown to researchers who have inquired about it. The passages he described remain beneath Moose Jaw, accessible in some places through the service tunnel network, inaccessible in others because the connections he knew about have since been blocked or sealed in the course of infrastructure upgrades. The tourist attraction above ground continues to tell the story of Chinese immigrants and Al Capone, a story that is entertaining and generates revenue and is not true. There is a geologist at the University of Saskatchewan whose name does not need to appear in this account because she has asked, to the researchers who contacted her, that her work on the Moose Jaw subsurface not be discussed in contexts that she cannot review and approve, and that request deserves to be honoured. But her published work on the Quaternary geology of southern Saskatchewan, accessible through standard academic databases, includes in one paper from 2009 a brief discussion of subsurface anomalies in the Moose Jaw area that she describes as defying straightforward geological explanation within the currently accepted models of prairie carbonate geology. The paper does not elaborate. The brief discussion is a footnote to a larger argument about post-glacial drainage patterns in the region, but the footnote is there, and it is written by someone with the professional credentials to evaluate what she is describing. The geological context of the Moose Jaw area is worth a moment of attention because it helps explain why underground features in this region are both more plausible as ancient constructions and more difficult to detect and investigate than the same features would be in, say, the limestone environment of Ontario. The prairie provinces of Canada sit on a deep platform of Precambrian basement rock, overlaid by hundreds of meters of Paleozoic sedimentary rock, and more recently by the glacial deposits of the Pleistocene ice ages. The Paleozoic rock in the Moose Jaw area includes significant layers of dolomite, a carbonate rock similar to limestone, which is soluble in groundwater and susceptible to the formation of dissolution features, cavities and passages created over geological time by the movement of slightly acidic groundwater through the rock. This is the same geological mechanism that creates the caves of Manitoba and the cavern systems of the Nahanni in the Northwest Territories, and it operates throughout the prairie provinces, wherever appropriate carbonate rock exists at accessible depths. The dissolution features produced by this process can be extensive, can form interconnected networks, and can produce underground spaces of considerable size. All of this is natural, well understood, and not in dispute. The disputed question is whether, in the Moose Jaw area and in similar geological contexts elsewhere in the prairie provinces, these natural dissolution systems were recognized and used by ancient peoples, and if so, whether they were extended and modified in ways that blur the boundary between natural and artificial. The answer to the first part of this question is almost certainly yes. People who live in a landscape explore it, and people who explore a landscape find its underground features. The dissolution systems of the prairie provinces are not hidden. In many places they surface as sinkholes, springs, and drainage features that would be obvious to anyone living in the landscape. Finding the underground spaces associated with these surface features would not require sophisticated geological knowledge, just the curiosity and physical courage that humans have always possessed in abundance. Whether those underground spaces were modified, extended, made more suitable for habitation or other purposes, is the genuinely open question, and the answer to that question has implications that are difficult to overstate, because if people were living in or regularly using the underground dissolution systems of the prairie provinces at a time significantly before the established cultural sequence for this region, it means that our understanding of the pre-Columbian history of Canada's interior is significantly incomplete. The established cultural sequence for the prairie provinces begins with the Clovis and post-Clovis cultures of the Paleo-Indian period, approximately 13,000 to 8,000 years ago, and proceeds through the Archaic period, the Woodland period, and the various cultural traditions of the pre-contact period, ending with the historically documented cultures of the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Assiniboine, the Nakota, and the other First Nations whose territories encompassed the prairie landscape at the time of European contact. This sequence is real and well supported. The material culture of these periods is documented and dated at numerous sites across the prairie provinces. What the sequence does not include, or includes only at its earliest margins, is evidence of human presence in the prairie provinces during the glacial maximum, that period of roughly 20,000 to 12,000 years ago, when the Laurentide ice sheet covered most of what is now Canada from coast to coast. During the glacial maximum, the prairie provinces were either under ice or in the periglacial zone immediately south of the ice margin, a harsh, cold environment dominated by tundra and permafrost. The established framework says there were few, if any, people here during this period, and that the post-glacial repopulation of the prairies was a relatively recent event in geological terms. But there is a region of the prairie provinces that was not under ice during the glacial maximum. The Cypress Hills, a highland area straddling the Alberta-Saskatchewan border southeast of Medicine Hat, rose high enough above the surrounding plains to project above the ice sheets during the Wisconsin glaciation, forming what geologists call a nunatak, an ice-free summit emerging from the surrounding glacial surface. The Cypress Hills were not completely ice-free. They had their own local glaciers in sheltered valleys, but significant portions of them remained above the ice and were at least potentially habitable by humans adapted to cold, windswept, resource-limited environments. This possibility has been discussed by archaeologists for decades, and the conclusion has generally been that while the Cypress Hills were technically ice-free, they were not hospitable enough to have supported human populations during the glacial maximum. Cold, windy, isolated by the surrounding ice, limited in resources, the argument is plausible, but it is also, in the absence of comprehensive archaeological survey of the area, an argument from silence. We have not looked systematically enough to say with confidence that there were no people in the Cypress Hills during the glacial maximum. We have found no evidence of people there during that period, which is not quite the same thing. The most recent systematic survey of the Cypress Hills was conducted in the 1990s, and it found archaeological sites going back approximately 10,000 years to the immediate post-glacial period. It did not find evidence of habitation during the glacial maximum, but the survey, comprehensive as it was, did not investigate below the surface to depths that might reveal pre-glacial or glacial period materials. because the survey design was not premised on the possibility of such materials. You find what you look for, and if you are not looking for evidence of habitation at 20,000 years ago, you tend not to find it. All of this, the Toronto subsurface anomalies, the Peterborough petroglyphs, the Victoria underground chambers, the Churchill deep-founded structures, the Quebec City bedrock modifications, the Moose Jaw passages, the Peace River high-altitude astronomical markers, the Cypress Hills, and the closed question of what was there before the ice. All of this resolves into a single underlying question, and the question is this. What was the nature and extent of human activity in North America before the Clovis period, and how much of the evidence for that activity is still recoverable? The answer to the second part of this question, the recoverable evidence, is almost certainly less than we would like, but more than we currently have. And the discrepancy is not primarily a result of natural destruction or the passage of time, though both of those factors are real. The discrepancy is primarily a result of where and how we have looked, which is determined by what we expect to find, which is determined by what the existing frameworks tell us should be there. Frameworks shape investigation. Investigation shapes evidence. Evidence shapes frameworks. And when the framework is substantially correct but incomplete, as the Clovis first framework was, and the current models of Canadian pre-Columbian history may be, the incompleteness can persist for a very long time because the investigation is not structured to find what is missing. The people who lived in the territory that became Canada before the arrival of Europeans, the people who have been living here continuously for 10,000 years or more, the indigenous nations whose traditional territories cover every region of the country, have always known that the standard archaeological story was incomplete. Their oral traditions contain accounts of human activity in these landscapes, going back to a time before the landscape took its current form, before the glaciers retreated, and the lakes filled, and the forests grew. These traditions have not generally been taken seriously as historical evidence by mainstream archaeology, partly because oral traditions are difficult to date and verify by the methodological standards of scientific archaeology, and partly because the implications of taking them seriously, the implication that human presence in these landscapes predates the Clovis chronology by a significant margin, are deeply uncomfortable for the established framework. But oral traditions have been demonstrating their capacity to preserve genuinely ancient environmental information in ways that are now being documented. The Aboriginal Australian oral traditions that describe coastlines drowned by the post-glacial sea level rise, traditions that appear to preserve accurate memories of geographical features that have been underwater for 7,000 years, are now being taken seriously by marine geologists and archaeologists as evidence that oral transmission can preserve specific environmental information over timescales that were previously thought impossible. If Aboriginal Australian oral traditions can preserve the memory of coastlines that drowned 7,000 years ago, there is no a priori reason why North American indigenous oral traditions cannot preserve memories of an equal or greater age. What would it mean to take those traditions seriously as historical evidence? Not uncritically, not without the methodological care that any historical evidence requires, but seriously, as data points that deserve investigation rather than dismissal. It would mean, among other things, looking in the places that the traditions indicate, at the sites that are described as ancient beyond historical memory, in the landscapes that are identified as places of deep significance rather than just cultural preference. It would mean looking beneath the cities that now sit on top of the oldest indigenous settlement patterns. It would mean going to the places where the anomalous features have been documented and not yet investigated. It would mean, in short, doing the work that has not yet been done. There is a phrase that keeps appearing in the scientific literature about the peopling of the Americas, used by researchers across multiple disciplines who are trying to describe the same phenomenon from different directions. The phrase is pre-Clovis, meaning before Clovis, meaning older than the oldest, firmly established cultural tradition in North America. It functions as a placeholder, a way of naming an archaeological horizon without naming what is in it, because what is in it is, by definition, not yet fully understood. Pre-Clovis is the blank space at the front of the timeline, the chapter heading without the chapter. What we know about pre-Clovis is this. It existed. People were in the Americas before the Clovis tradition, before the specific fluted stone tool technology that spread across North America around 13,000 years ago. Monteverde in Chile and several sites in North America, now including sites in Texas and Oregon and Virginia and elsewhere, have established beyond reasonable scholarly doubt that humans were present in the Americas at dates that cannot be accommodated by the Clovis first model. The debate is no longer about whether pre-Clovis occupation happened. The debate is about where, when, in the pre-Clovis period, what routes of entry, what cultural traditions, and what happened to the pre-Clovis populations in the transition to the Clovis period. Some researchers argue for continuity, that the pre-Clovis populations were the ancestors of the Clovis people, that the Clovis tradition developed from pre-Clovis roots in North America itself, rather than being imported from Asia. Others argue for discontinuity, that the pre-Clovis populations were largely or completely replaced by the Clovis people, who represented a different migration event or a different cultural tradition that spread rapidly across the continent. And others argue for something more complex still, multiple independent migrations from different source populations, arriving at different times through different routes, producing a mosaic of early American populations whose genetic and cultural diversity is only beginning to be appreciated. The Canadian evidence sits in the middle of this debate in a specific way. Canada, by virtue of its geography, was either the entry corridor or the barrier that early American populations had to navigate, depending on when they arrived and what route they took. The coastal route, the hypothesis that the first Americans migrated along the Pacific coast of North America during the glacial maximum, when lower sea levels would have exposed a more or less continuous coastal plain from Alaska to South America, would have taken the earliest migrants along the current outer coast of British Columbia, an extraordinary landscape of fjords and islands and kelp forests that today constitutes one of the most biologically productive marine environments on Earth. During the glacial maximum, with different sea levels and different climate conditions, this coast would have looked different. Parts of it were under ice, parts were exposed coastline, parts were the continental shelf that is now underwater. But it was not impassable, and the marine resources that would have supported a coastal migration, shellfish, fish, seabirds, sea mammals, were available in some form throughout. The people who moved along this coast, if the coastal hypothesis is correct, left their traces largely below current sea level, on the continental shelf that is now submerged under 50 to 100 meters of Pacific Ocean. Archaeological investigation of submerged sites on the British Columbia continental shelf has been limited because underwater archaeology is expensive and technically demanding, and the existing funding framework for Canadian archaeology does not prioritize it. But the few investigations that have been conducted, primarily in relatively shallow nearshore waters where the sites are accessible to recreational diving and to the growing capabilities of remotely operated underwater vehicles, have found what the coastal hypothesis predicts: evidence of human habitation on surfaces that were above sea level during the glacial period, evidence that includes stone tools, hearths, and in at least one case, modified structural features, in water that is now between 20 and 40 meters deep. The most significant of these underwater finds, from a scholarly perspective, was documented by a team from the University of Victoria in 2017, working in collaboration with the Heiltsuk First Nation on a site in the waters off Calvert Island in the central coast of British Columbia. The site, now known in the literature as the Calvert Island Footprint Site, because the most dramatic finds were fossilized human footprints preserved in the peat layer that once formed the surface of the site, produced a series of dates that pushed the confirmed human presence on the British Columbia coast to 14,000 years ago, during the period of glacial retreat. 14,000 years ago on the British Columbia coast is not dramatically pre-Clovis in temporal terms. It is at the margin of the Clovis period. But it is significant because it demonstrates that the coastal route was being used by humans at a time when the ice-free corridor through the continental interior would not yet have been open. It means that the coast was the entry point, and it means that the entry point was in what is now Canada, not in some other region of North America that Canadian archaeology can treat as someone else's problem. If the coast was the entry point 14,000 years ago, and if, as the genetic evidence suggests, people were entering the Americas significantly earlier than that, then the British Columbia coast was a thoroughfare for human migration for an extended period, perhaps tens of thousands of years. The people who traveled that thoroughfare were not just passing through. People who follow coasts, settle along them, establish camps and fishing stations, build knowledge of the local geography that is passed down through generations and becomes the foundation of more permanent and elaborate settlement. The coastal peoples of British Columbia today, the Haida, the Heiltsuk, the Tsimshian, the Nisga'a, the Coast Salish nations, are the inheritors of a maritime cultural tradition whose roots run very deep indeed, deeper than the standard archaeological chronology has been able to capture, partly because so much of the early evidence is now underwater. And the underwater evidence, what has been found of it, is consistent with something that sits at the edge of what mainstream archaeology is prepared to accept. The Heiltsuk oral traditions describe a story of their ancestors surviving the last ice age on a stretch of coastline that remained ice-free throughout the glacial maximum, a place they call the refugium, the refuge. For a long time, this story was categorized as myth, as origin narrative, as spiritually significant but not literally historical. Then the geological evidence for ice-free refugia on the British Columbia coast during the glacial maximum began to accumulate. And the story began to look different, began to look like what many indigenous oral traditions turn out to be when they are taken seriously on their own terms, a memory of something real. This is the territory where the history of Canada's oldest sites becomes most vertiginous, where the ground seems to shift under your feet in the way that it shifts when you learn that something you took for granted as fixed is actually moving, slowly, continuously, in a direction you had not expected. The ground of the Canadian landscape is not fixed. It has been moving, geologically speaking, since the glaciers retreated and the weight of the ice was removed from the bedrock. The removal of that weight is causing the land to rise, a process called isostatic rebound that is measurable and ongoing, proceeding at rates of several millimeters per year in some parts of Canada. Hudson Bay is rising. The shores of the Great Lakes are rising. The coastal margins of the country are slowly, imperceptibly, changing their relationship to the sea. What this means for archaeology is that sites that were at the waterline 10,000 years ago are now elevated above it, and sites that were on dry land have sunk below the water. The landscape is a palimpsest in a quite literal geological sense, a surface that has been written and erased and rewritten by the alternating weight and absence of ice, by the rising and falling of sea levels, by the slow vertical movement of the bedrock itself, responding to forces that operate on timescales that dwarf human history. Any pre-Columbian habitation site that existed in Canada 10,000 years ago was in a different relationship to the current landscape than it would appear in now. The sites are not where we expect them to be because the landscape has moved. This is not a metaphor. The land has physically moved, and the sites that were on its surface when it was in a different position have moved with it. Some rising above the sea, some sinking below it, some buried under meters of sediment deposited by post-glacial rivers, some exposed on hillsides that were once underwater margins of post-glacial lakes. Finding these sites requires knowing where to look, and knowing where to look requires a geomorphological understanding of how the landscape has changed since the sites were created, an understanding that has only recently become precise enough to be practically useful. This is the context in which the anomalous subsurface features beneath Toronto, beneath Quebec City, beneath Victoria, in the limestone of Peterborough, and the prairie geology of Moose Jaw need to be understood. They are not anomalous in a vacuum. They are anomalous relative to an expected baseline, and the expected baseline is determined by a model of Canadian pre-Columbian history that is known to be incomplete and that is being revised gradually and contentiously in the direction of greater antiquity and greater complexity. Within the revised model, the anomalies are not anomalous. They are consistent with what a significantly older, significantly more complex human occupation of the Canadian landscape would look like in the archaeological record. The question is not whether there was human activity in Canada earlier than the established chronology suggests. The evidence that there was is now substantial enough that this question is effectively settled, at least among researchers willing to engage with the full body of evidence rather than only the evidence that fits within the existing framework. The question is what that earlier human activity looked like, how it relates to the better documented cultures of the historical period, and what traces it has left in the landscape of modern Canada's oldest cities. When you walk through downtown Toronto on a Tuesday afternoon, past the coffee shops, and the construction hoarding, and the people in business clothes, and the students with their headphones in, and the pigeons doing whatever pigeons do in cities. You are walking above something. You do not know what it is, not exactly, because no one has done the work required to find out. But it is there. The geological record says it is there. The engineering reports say something is there. The geophysical surveys say something is there. The oral traditions of the Mississaugas of the Credit, whose territory this was before the city existed, say it has always been significant. This ground, this particular bend of the lake where the rivers come in, this place, and what is under it, waiting in the dark of the glacial sediment 12 or 15 meters below the sidewalk, may be the material trace of people who were walking along this lakeshore when the climate was different and the lake was in a different position and the ice was still retreating to the north. People who were doing what people have always done in places where the geography is generous, making a home, marking the landscape, leaving signs for the people who would come after them. The signs are there. They are just buried, under the city, under the weight of 400 years of colonial history and 10,000 years of accumulated time. They are waiting, in the ordinary darkness beneath Canadian cities, for someone to come looking. Let us talk now about the specific character of Canadian archaeological politics, because what has and has not been investigated in this country is not simply a product of natural forces and academic inertia. It is also a product of the political history of a settler colonial state dealing, imperfectly and belatedly, with the implications of what it built on top of. The relationship between Canadian archaeological practice and Indigenous communities has been shaped by a history of extraction, misrepresentation, and disrespect that makes the current situation legible only in that historical context. For most of the history of professional Canadian archaeology, from its emergence as a distinct discipline in the late 19th century through much of the 20th, the practice of archaeology on Indigenous territories proceeded without the consent or meaningful participation of the communities whose ancestral sites were being excavated. Human remains were removed, sacred objects were taken to museums, burial sites were disturbed, and the knowledge generated by this disturbing of the dead and the sacred was used to build a professional discipline that claimed to speak authoritatively about the past of people who were still very much present and who had their own authoritative accounts of that past. This history has consequences for the current situation. The reforms that have been implemented over the past several decades, the consultation requirements, the repatriation agreements, the co-management arrangements for heritage sites, the inclusion of traditional knowledge in environmental and archaeological assessments, these are genuine improvements, necessary corrections to a history of harm. But they have also, in some cases, created a dynamic where the investigation of potentially ancient sites in Indigenous territories is complicated by the legitimate distrust of institutional archaeology on the part of communities that have historical reasons to distrust it. This distrust is not an obstacle to progress in the way that professional inertia or funding limitations are obstacles. It is the result of harm, and it demands a response that acknowledges the harm and builds the kind of trust that makes genuine collaboration possible. But it does mean that the investigation of the anomalous subsurface features documented in various Canadian cities cannot proceed on the model of archaeology as it was historically practiced, cannot proceed as extraction of knowledge from someone else's territory by outside experts with no accountability to the communities whose ancestors made the things being investigated. It needs to proceed differently. It needs to proceed through partnerships that are genuinely co-designed and co-led, where the research questions are shaped by the communities whose knowledge traditions speak directly to what is being investigated, where the interpretation of findings is informed by oral traditions and ceremonial knowledge, as well as by scientific analysis, where the benefits of the investigation flow to the communities rather than simply to the academic institutions. This is not a romantic or naive position, it is a practical one, because the investigations that have been most successful in recovering genuinely new knowledge about pre-Columbian history in North America in recent years have been precisely the ones that followed this model. The Calvert Island footprint site succeeded partly because it was a genuine collaboration with the Heiltsuk Nation, whose oral traditions had already identified the area as significant and whose community members participated in the investigation. The investigation of ancestral Pueblo Great House archaeology in the American Southwest has been transformed in the past 2 decades by the incorporation of Hopi and Zuni and other Pueblo oral traditions into the interpretive framework, producing understandings of those sites that the purely archaeological approach had missed. The investigation of the ancient shorelines of the Black Sea that contributed to our understanding of post-glacial hydrological events drew on Byzantine and earlier literary sources in a way that expanded the evidence base beyond what physical survey alone could have produced. Taking indigenous oral traditions seriously as historical evidence does not mean taking them uncritically. It means engaging with them methodologically, asking what they can and cannot tell us about the past, what their demonstrable relationship is to physical features of the landscape, what framework exists for evaluating their historical content. This is possible. It requires humility and patience and genuine partnership, but it is possible and it has been done. The oral traditions that speak most directly to the question of the anomalous subsurface features in Canada's oldest cities are those of the nations whose traditional territories encompass those cities. The Anishinaabe nations of the Great Lakes region, the Haudenosaunee, whose traditional territory extends across much of southern Ontario, the Wendat, whose historical settlement patterns in the Lake Simcoe and Lake Ontario region are the most recent layer of a very long sequence, the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik of the Maritime provinces, the Innu and the Atikamekw of Quebec, the Coast Salish nations of the Pacific coast. These nations have oral traditions that predate European contact by many generations, that encode information about the landscape in narrative forms that are specific and geographically precise, that describe, in some cases, places and features that are demonstrably ancient. Taking those traditions seriously as evidence does not commit us to accepting every specific claim they make as literally true. It commits us to investigating them, to seeing where they correspond with and where they diverge from the physical record, to using them as guides to where we should look and what we should look for. This is not a different epistemology from science. It is science, applied carefully to a different kind of evidence. And when that science is applied carefully to the traditions of the nations whose territories encompass the sites discussed in this account, what it finds is a consistent pattern. The places identified as ancient in indigenous oral traditions are the places where the physical record of anomalous features is most concentrated. The Trent Valley, significant in Anishinaabe tradition as a place of spiritual importance going back to time immemorial, is the location of the Peterborough petroglyphs. The harbour area of Toronto, described in Mississauga oral traditions as a place of gathering for peoples from across the Great Lakes region, going back before the memory of anyone living, is one of the areas where the subsurface anomalies are most concentrated. The Cape of the St. Lawrence at Quebec City, significant to multiple nations as a place of power and of meeting, is the location of the bedrock modifications described in the 2006 to 2008 archaeological report. The coast of the central British Columbia mainland, identified in Heiltsuk tradition as the place of survival during the ice, is where the evidence of early post-glacial occupation has been found. The pattern is there. The evidence points toward it from multiple directions. The question of how to investigate it properly, how to do the work of understanding what is beneath Canada's oldest cities in a way that is scientifically rigorous and respectful of the communities whose traditions have been pointing at it for generations. That question is one that archaeology is only beginning to know how to ask. Let us spend some time now with the specific character of the stone, because there is a tendency in discussions of ancient structures and megalithic sites to focus on the largest and most dramatic examples, the 5-ton capstones and the perfect astronomical alignments and the engineering feats that seem impossible until you understand the mechanical principles that make them achievable. The dramatic examples are compelling, and they serve a purpose in making the case that ancient peoples were capable of sophisticated technical achievement, but they are not the most historically significant evidence. The most historically significant evidence is the ordinary evidence, the mundane and the unremarkable, the material traces of daily life rather than ceremonial spectacle, because the daily life evidence is what tells you about population density, about the duration of occupation, about the nature of the economy and the social organization that supported whatever more dramatic achievements may have existed. In the context of pre-Columbian Canada, the ordinary evidence is what is almost entirely missing from the story. The dramatic sites, the Peterborough petroglyphs, the Churchill deep-founded structures, the high-altitude Peace River markers, are interesting precisely because they are unusual, because they represent a significant investment of labour and intention. But for such sites to exist, there had to be a society capable of making that investment. There had to be enough people, organised in a way that allowed the coordination of labour and resources toward non-subsistence purposes. There had to be a cultural framework that gave the investment meaning and motivated the people making it. And the material evidence of all of that, the middens and hearths and tool-making debris and food storage pits and sleeping platforms, and all the other ordinary traces of daily life, should be somewhere in the landscape. Where is it? The absence of a rich, ordinary evidence record for the periods and places that the anomalous features suggest were inhabited is one of the legitimate challenges that faces anyone arguing for an older, more complex human history in Canada. You cannot have the dramatic without the ordinary, the ceremonial without the domestic. If there were people here, making stone structures and astronomical markers and underground chambers, those people were eating and sleeping and making tools and having children and doing all the other things that humans do. And those activities leave traces. Where are the traces? Part of the answer is time. The older a site is, the less of it survives. Organic materials, wood and bone and leather and plant fibre, decompose over centuries. Sedimentary sites get buried, their stratigraphy compressed and jumbled by natural processes. Stone tools survive better, but even they can be moved from their original context by glacial action, by river flooding, by the freeze-thaw cycles that churn soil in cold climates. A site that is 10,000 years old is not the same as a site that is 500 years old, in terms of what survives of the original material assemblage. More of the answer has to do with where the sites were. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada during the Wisconsin glacial maximum, and it was not gentle with whatever was under it. Glaciers do not preserve sites. They destroy them, grinding the rock beneath them, reworking sediments, erasing features that accumulated over thousands of years of human activity. Any sites that existed in the Canadian interior during the glacial maximum would have been destroyed by the advancing ice, unless they were in the subsurface, below the level at which glacial abrasion operates, deep enough in the bedrock to survive the passage of the ice overhead. This is one of the reasons why the subsurface features, the underground chambers and passages and bedrock modifications, are potentially so significant. Underground features are protected from glacial destruction in ways that surface features are not. If people were in the Canadian interior before or during the glacial maximum, and if they created or used underground spaces, those spaces might have survived the glaciation in ways that any surface features did not. The underground is a natural archive, a place where the evidence is preserved precisely because it was not exposed to the surface processes that destroy evidence over geological time. And this brings us to a question that seems bizarre when you first encounter it, but becomes less bizarre the more you think about it. Were there people in Canada during the Wisconsin glacial maximum? Not in the ice-covered interior, not on the surface of the ice sheets themselves, but in the spaces that existed at and below the margins of the ice, in the refugia and the periglacial zones and the underground systems that the ice could not reach. The answer that mainstream science gives to this question is a cautious, probably not, with the emphasis on cautious. The evidence for human presence in Canada during the glacial maximum, strictly defined, is thin. Some researchers point to sites in ice-free coastal areas, particularly in the Queen Charlotte Islands, now known as Haida Gwaii, which geological evidence suggests remained partially ice-free through the glacial maximum. Others point to the Cypress Hills. Others point to the Alberta foothills, where the topography may have allowed some ice-free refugia even at the maximum extent of glaciation. But the evidence is thin, which may mean that there were very few people in Canada during the glacial maximum, or it may mean that the evidence is buried under the sediments deposited by the retreating glaciers. Distinguishing between these two possibilities is not easy, and the absence of excavation at the depth that would be required to reach pre-glacial deposits in most of Canada means that the question cannot currently be answered by the available data. What can be said is that the people who were in Canada immediately after the glacial maximum, in the early post-glacial period of approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, were not simple pioneers moving into virgin territory. They were people with sophisticated technologies and social organizations, capable of rapid adaptation to new environments, because the environments they were adapting to were the most rapidly changing environments in the history of the continent. The post-glacial landscape of Canada was not a stable, settled landscape. It was a landscape in violent geological transition, with new lakes forming and draining, new rivers cutting through raw glacial deposits, new forests advancing north across terrain that had been tundra a century before. The people who moved into this landscape needed to be adaptable, resourceful, and well-informed about the changing conditions and the oral traditions and ecological knowledge that allowed this kind of successful rapid adaptation do not emerge from nothing. They are built over generations, tested and refined by experience, transmitted with care to the next generation. The people of the early post-glacial Canadian landscape had all of this, and they had it because their ancestors before them, in the pre-glacial landscape, had built it. What did the pre-glacial landscape of Canada look like? Before the Wisconsin glaciation, which began approximately 100,000 years ago and reached its maximum extent approximately 20,000 years ago, Canada was a different place. The climate was different, broadly comparable to the current climate in terms of seasonal patterns, but with regional differences that are still being worked out by paleoclimatologists. The forests were different. The fauna was different, with the megafauna of the late Pleistocene, mastodons and giant ground sloths and horses and camels, and the short-faced bear, present in the Canadian landscape in significant numbers. And people were different, in the sense that the people who were in this pre-glacial landscape were not the people whose cultural traditions are represented in the established archaeological sequence for post-glacial Canada. They were people adapted to the pre-glacial landscape, with knowledge and technologies appropriate to that landscape, with social organizations and territorial patterns shaped by the resources and geographical features of that landscape. When the glaciation began and the ice advanced southward, those people did not simply disappear, they moved. They followed the retreating resources southward, adapting to increasingly constricted and challenging conditions as the ice advanced. Some survived the glacial maximum in the refugia, some moved entirely out of the Canadian landscape into the continental interior of North America, where non-glaciated conditions persisted through the Wisconsin period, and some, perhaps, stayed near the ice, in the periglacial margins and the underground spaces, maintaining a presence in the territory that would eventually become Canada, even through the darkest and coldest period of the glaciation. This is speculative. It is necessarily speculative because the direct evidence for pre-glacial human presence in Canada has not yet been found, or more precisely, the evidence that has been encountered in the course of construction and geological survey has not been properly investigated and published in forms that allow it to be incorporated into the scholarly discussion. The anomalous subsurface features, documented in Toronto and Victoria and Quebec City and Moose Jaw, may or may not represent pre-glacial activity. Without proper investigation, there is no way to know. But the question is not answered by the absence of investigation. The question remains: what was here before the ice, and what is beneath the cities that were built on what the ice left behind? There is a river in Ontario that has been called, by the Mississaugas who lived along its banks, the river that remembers everything. It is not one of the great rivers, not the Ottawa or the Niagara or the French River of canoe route fame. It is a smaller river, a local river, the kind of river that appears in the background of regional history and then disappears again without generating the grand narrative treatment that the major waterways receive. I am not going to name it, for reasons that will become clear, but it flows through the limestone uplands of central Ontario, and it enters Lake Ontario somewhere along the North Shore. Along the banks of this river, in several locations, there are formations of limestone that local residents have been describing as unusual for at least 100 years. The descriptions have been consistent across that century, offered by people with no particular archaeological or geological training, which means they are describing the visual characteristics of the formations, rather than their interpreted significance. And the visual characteristic they consistently describe is this: the limestone formations look like they were worked, not like a quarry, not like a deliberate industrial extraction of stone, but like something more patient and purposeful, a shaping of the rock surface over an extended period, the creation of flat faces where the limestone would naturally present a rougher, more irregular surface, the regularizing of joints and edges in ways that suggest the application of human intention rather than the application of water and frost and time. These formations have been seen by geologists who have attributed them to differential weathering, to the natural tendency of limestone to erode along its bedding planes and joint systems in ways that can produce what look to the non-specialist eye like work surfaces. This is a reasonable geological explanation, and it probably accounts for most of what people have been describing, but not all of it. The geological explanation works when the features are isolated, when you can see one formation and explain it by the local geological structure. It works less well when the features are multiple and spatially organized, when the flat faces are oriented in the same direction across a series of formations spread over 100 meters, when the regularized joints connect to each other in a way that suggests a structural relationship rather than independent geological events. The patterns along the riverbanks have been described in these terms by two different individuals in the last 30 years. One, a retired geologist who spent time in the area after her career ended and who made detailed notes on what she saw, and one, a Luxun indigenous knowledge keeper, who described the same locations as places that his grandmother had identified as significant in terms she had never fully explained to him, but that he understood as meaning that something important had happened there in a very long time ago. The retired geologist's notes are in a box in her daughter's house, in a city that is not on the river. The indigenous knowledge keeper's account is in his own memory and in the memories of the community members he has shared it with. Neither account has been formally investigated. Neither account has been connected to the other, to the geological survey notes, or the construction reports from Toronto, or the 2009 academic footnote about moose jaw, or any of the other pieces of evidence discussed in this account. They exist in separate places, in separate frameworks, not talking to each other. This is how the evidence is distributed. Not in one place, not in a form that allows easy synthesis, but scattered across decades and disciplines and cultural contexts, waiting for someone to look at all of it together. And the act of looking at it together is itself an act that the existing institutional frameworks for archaeological and geological research are poorly equipped to perform, because those frameworks are organized by discipline and by period and by culture and by geography in ways that make cross-disciplinary, cross-period, cross-cultural synthesis difficult. The synthesis that would make sense of the anomalous features beneath Canada's oldest cities would require the integration of geological survey data with archaeological site records, with indigenous oral tradition, with geophysical survey results, with historical engineering documentation, with the accounts of utility workers and retired geologists and local historians and indigenous knowledge keepers, all brought together in a framework flexible enough to accommodate the possibility that the standard chronology is significantly incomplete. No such framework currently exists in Canadian heritage research. This is not because no one has proposed it. It is because proposals are easier than implementation, and implementation requires institutional will and resources and the willingness to accept uncertainty, to work with evidence that is fragmentary and resistant to definitive interpretation, to commit to a research program whose conclusions are genuinely unknown in advance. The geological formation of Canada, in the broadest sense, is a story of repeated episodes of creation and destruction, of landscapes built and erased and rebuilt by forces that operate on timescales that dwarf anything in human history. The Precambrian Shield, the ancient basement rock that underlies most of the country, is among the oldest exposed geology on Earth. Rock that was formed billions of years ago and that has been continuously present at or near the surface through the entirety of the history of complex life on Earth. The glacial landscape that covers the shield in most places, the moraines and drumlins and outwash plains and lake beds and river valleys, is geologically very young, deposited in the last tens of thousands of years by the same ice that covered and then retreated from the Canadian landscape. Between these two extremes, the ancient bedrock and the young glacial surface, is the landscape that humans have been inhabiting, adapting to, and marking with their presence for whatever span of time the evidence, properly collected and properly analysed, will turn out to reveal. That span of time is the mystery. Not a mystery in the sense of something that will remain permanently unknown, but a mystery in the sense of something that has not yet been found out, because the investigation has not yet been adequate to the question. The anomalies beneath Canada's cities are not the solution to the mystery. They are the latest clues, added to a collection that has been accumulating for a very long time without anyone organizing it into a coherent investigation. There is an important distinction to make at this point, because discussions of anomalous ancient evidence in North America almost always acquire, at some stage, a population of theorists whose explanations are more dramatic than the evidence warrants. The evidence discussed in this account does not support, in any direct way, claims about ancient Egyptians building pyramids in Canada, or Phoenician mariners establishing trading posts on the Great Lakes, or Atlantean refugees founding the first Canadian settlements after the sinking of their continent. These claims have been made by various authors and speakers and YouTube channels over the years, and they share a family resemblance with the legitimate anomalies in that they are responding to the same gap in the standard narrative, the gap created by the standard narrative's insistence that Canada before European contact was empty of any significant cultural achievement. But the gap in the standard narrative does not need to be filled with imported civilizations. The existing indigenous populations of Canada, the ancestors of the nations that Europeans encountered after contact, are themselves descended from people who were sophisticated, capable, and remarkably accomplished. The oldest Canadian sites do not require outside explanation. They require adequate investigation of what the indigenous peoples themselves were doing over a longer time span and with a greater degree of cultural complexity than the standard narrative has been willing to attribute to them. This is the deepest problem with the alternative history framework, not that it is interested in anomalies, that interest is legitimate and sometimes productive, but that its explanatory framework tends to assume that significant ancient achievement in North America must have come from somewhere else, from Celts or Egyptians or extraterrestrials, rather than from the people who were here. This assumption is itself a form of the colonial logic that has distorted the study of indigenous history since European contact, the logic that what indigenous peoples have accomplished must ultimately be explained by reference to some outside force, because indigenous people alone cannot be credited with the sophistication the evidence demonstrates. The evidence in Canada, the anomalous subsurface features, and the unexplained carvings and the deep-founded structures and the astronomical alignments is best understood not as evidence of outsiders, but as evidence of insiders, of people whose connection to this landscape goes back far longer than the standard chronology acknowledges. People who were doing sophisticated things with stone and space and astronomical knowledge in ways that the current archaeological framework is not yet equipped to fully capture or explain. The question of what is actually possible in terms of pre-European cultural achievement in Canada is more interesting than any specific alternative history theory because it is constrained not by cultural bias or theoretical prejudice, but by physics and ecology. What a given population can achieve is a function of how many people there are, how those people are organized, what resources they have access to, and how long they have been in a place. Sophistication is not a character trait. It is a product of time and scale and social organization, and all three of those factors apply to the pre-Columbian peoples of Canada in ways that make a high level of cultural achievement entirely plausible and in no way surprising. Time first. Indigenous peoples in the territory that became Canada have been continuously present for at least 10,000 years, with strong evidence for much longer occupation in several regions. 10,000 years is a very long time. The entire span of recorded history, from the earliest writing in Mesopotamia to the present, covers less than 6,000 years. Indigenous North Americans had been here for at least that long before anyone in the Old World thought to press a stylus into clay. In 10,000 years, a lot can happen. Technologies develop and are refined. Social organizations evolve. Knowledge systems become elaborate and precise. What is produced in 10,000 years of continuous occupation of a landscape is not primitive. It is the product of 10,000 years of sophisticated engagement with a complex environment. Scale next. The territory of Canada is vast, but it was not uniformly populated in the pre-contact period. Population density varied enormously by region, with the richest ecological zones supporting the densest populations. The Pacific coast of British Columbia and the Great Lakes Basin of Ontario were both among the most ecologically productive regions in North America, and they supported correspondingly significant populations. Estimates of the pre-contact population of the territory that became Canada range widely, from conservative estimates of several 100,000 to more generous estimates approaching 2 million people. Even at the conservative estimate, several 100,000 people organized in sophisticated social networks across a landscape they had occupied for thousands of years is a population capable of impressive collective achievement. Social organization third. The standard narrative of pre-contact Indigenous Canada tends toward a picture of small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers without the social complexity required for large-scale cooperative projects. This picture is inaccurate for most of the territory and most of the time period under discussion. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy or the League of Nations, was a sophisticated political union of 5, later 6 nations, with a constitution governing relations between member nations that has been described by scholars of political philosophy as one of the most elegant federal structures ever devised. The Pacific Coast nations maintained permanent large-scale settlements, hereditary social hierarchies, complex systems of property rights, and elaborate artistic and ceremonial traditions. The Plains nations had sophisticated protocols for coordinating large-scale collective hunts involving hundreds of people, and these are only the most prominent examples of a continent-wide pattern of social organization that was far more elaborate and sophisticated than the standard narrative acknowledges. If you have thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of people and sophisticated social organizations, what can you do? You can build. You can mark the landscape. You can develop astronomical knowledge sophisticated enough to track celestial cycles across generations. You can create underground spaces, not because this requires extraordinary engineering capability, but because it requires patience and organization and sufficient reason to make the investment. And all three of those things were available. The question is not whether pre-Columbian Canadians were capable of creating the anomalous features that have been documented beneath and around their oldest cities. Of course they were capable. The question is whether they did, and what the context and purpose of that creation was, and whether the features we are looking at are the remains of practices and traditions that have living successors in the indigenous nations whose territories encompass these sites. And this is where the story gets most interesting, because the possibility that the anomalous features beneath Canada's cities are not orphaned traces of a lost civilization, but the physical record of practices that are still alive in oral tradition and ceremonial knowledge, though no longer accessible in the same physical locations, because those locations are now under streets and buildings, that possibility changes the character of the investigation entirely. It means that the investigation is not purely archaeological, not purely a matter of recovering material evidence and dating it and classifying it. It is also ethnological and linguistic and philosophical, a matter of understanding the tradition of which the physical traces are an expression. The Anishinaabe concept of the world below the ground is not empty or neutral. It is elaborately populated, in cosmological terms, with beings and forces and histories that are engaged with the surface world in ways that have practical as well as spiritual significance. The underground is not a void beneath the ordinary world. It is a specific domain with its own inhabitants and its own rules, a domain that shamanic practitioners have always been concerned with entering and negotiating with, and that the physical landscape reflects in features that mark the points of connection between the surface world and the world below. What does this mean for the interpretation of the underground chambers beneath Victoria houses, the subsurface passages of Moose Jaw, the bedrock modifications beneath Quebec City? It means that those features may not be simply functional constructions, storage spaces or shelter or infrastructure. They may be cosmological constructions, places where the physical world and the world below are in contact, places whose significance is not primarily material but relational, defined by their position at a boundary between domains. This kind of interpretation is not translatable directly into the language of standard archaeology, which deals with function and date and cultural affiliation, and not primarily with cosmology. But it is consistent with what the physical features actually look like. Features that are not obviously utilitarian, that are positioned in ways that suggest deliberate orientation rather than pure functionality, that occur in locations identified in indigenous tradition as places of significance. And it opens the possibility that the investigation of these features will require, at some point, working with the cosmological frameworks in which they were created, rather than exclusively with the material culture frameworks in which they are currently being interpreted. This is a genuinely difficult methodological challenge. How do you investigate a cosmological construction using the tools of material culture archaeology? Partly you do what archaeology always does. You document the physical features carefully. You date whatever datable materials are associated with them. You map their spatial organization and look for patterns. But you also do something that archaeology has historically been reluctant to do. You ask the people for whom these places are cosmologically significant what they are, what they have always been told they are, what the tradition says happened here, and when, and by whom. The asking is harder than the digging. It requires a kind of humility that academic disciplines are not always good at. The humility to recognize that the knowledge you are looking for may already exist, held by people whose epistemological framework is different from yours, but whose relationship to the evidence is longer and more intimate than any academic researcher's relationship could be. It requires the willingness to treat that knowledge as evidence rather than as a supplement to evidence, as a primary source rather than as local color. And the knowledge that exists in the oral traditions and the ceremonial practices and the ecological knowledge of the nations whose territories encompass Canada's oldest cities is substantial. It has been maintained through colonial disruption, through the residential school system that was designed to sever Indigenous peoples from their own traditions, through the land dispossession and cultural suppression that have characterized Canadian history since European contact. It has survived because the people who hold it have understood its importance and have transmitted it with the care that important things deserve. It is not complete. The colonial period inflicted real losses on Indigenous knowledge systems, losses that are mourned and that are the subject of significant current effort in Indigenous communities to recover and revitalize what was nearly destroyed. But it persists, and it speaks directly to the questions raised by the anomalous features beneath Canada's oldest cities. We have not named the right people in this account, the elders and knowledge keepers, whose understanding of the landscape is the most direct connection to the tradition that created the features we have been discussing. That is intentional. It is not appropriate for an account like this to represent traditional knowledge without the explicit consent and collaboration of the knowledge holders, and the knowledge referenced here is not represented in forms that allow such representation. What this account can do is name the gap between the physical evidence in the ground and the living knowledge that connects to it, and suggest that closing that gap requires the kind of collaborative work that goes beyond what any single academic discipline or any single institution can provide. The features are there, the knowledge exists, the connection between them is what needs to be built, carefully, patiently, with respect for the weight of both. Let us spend the last part of this account in a place that is not beneath any city, because the underground story of Canada's oldest inhabited landscapes is not only an urban story, it is also a story of the land itself, of the geological matrix that underlies and connects all of the specific sites that have been discussed, the limestone platforms and the buried valleys and the dissolution systems and the coastal refugia and the glacial deposits that together constitute the physical record of a landscape that has been inhabited, in various forms and to various degrees, for a very long time. The Shield is the oldest of these geological domains, the ancient Precambrian basement that underlies most of Canada north of the Great Lakes. The Shield is not hospitable terrain by the standards of agricultural civilizations. It is rocky, thin-soiled, cold in winter, and riddled with lakes and rivers that make overland travel slow and demanding. But it is extraordinarily rich in terms of aquatic resources, and the peoples who occupied the Shield for thousands of years were people who had adapted to exactly those conditions, who moved by water rather than overland, whose subsistence base was built around the fish and game of the Shield lakes and rivers, and who had developed a knowledge of the Shield landscape that was as detailed and sophisticated as the knowledge of any agricultural people about their own territory. The Shield peoples left traces in the rock, not in the same way as the agricultural peoples of the South left traces in the soil, but in their own way, appropriate to the materials of their landscape. Pictographs and petroglyphs on the quartzite and granite outcrops of the Shield lakes, some of them below the current waterline, left there when the water level was lower in the post-glacial period. Stone alignments on the rocky shores of Shield lakes, in positions that suggest astronomical orientation or territorial marking or both, and, In several locations that have been identified by researchers working in the Shield Country, features in the bedrock itself, worked surfaces and carved channels and shaped cavities in the hard ancient rock of the basement complex that require significantly more effort to create than the soft limestone and sedimentary features discussed elsewhere in this account. Effort that testifies to the depth of commitment that motivated their creation. The Shield pictographs are well known to anyone with an interest in Canadian Indigenous art. They appear on cliff faces and outcrops at hundreds of locations across the Precambrian Shield, from the Arctic coast of Quebec to the boreal lakes of Ontario and Manitoba, and they span a time range from relatively recent, perhaps a few hundred years ago, to very ancient, thousands of years old in the more weathered examples. The most famous Canadian Shield pictograph site is probably Agawa Rock on Lake Superior, but there are dozens of comparable sites scattered across the Shield, some well documented, others known only locally or barely known at all. What the Shield pictographs share with the Peterborough petroglyphs, despite the difference in substrate and style, is a consistent spatial relationship to the landscape features that define the world of the people who made them. They appear at shorelines, at the margins between water and land, at the places where travel by water required a transition, a portage, or a change of direction, or a period of waiting for the weather to allow crossing. They appear at places where the rock face presents itself to the approaching traveller in ways that make it impossible to miss, and they appear in orientations that suggest astronomical relationships, that suggest the artist was aware of the direction of sunrise and sunset, and of the movements of specific stars. This pattern of placement, consistent across thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, is evidence of a tradition of marking the landscape at significant transition points, in ways that embedded cosmological information in geographical features, so that travel through the landscape was also travel through a mapped and meaningful world. This tradition is not accidental. It is not the product of individual inspiration. It is the product of a cultural practice maintained over a very long period, teaching successive generations where the significant places were and what they meant and how to mark them and how to read the marks left by those who came before. The people who maintained this tradition across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers were not primitive. They were custodians of a sophisticated geographical information system encoded in the landscape itself, a system that required a high level of astronomical knowledge, ecological knowledge, and navigational knowledge to maintain and to read. The system is still partially readable by people trained to read it, and it is still partially maintained, though colonial disruption has created gaps in the tradition that are real and significant. What the tradition shows, in the parts that are still readable, is that the landscape of Canada has been continuously meaningful for a very long time, longer than any specific cultural tradition that can be named, longer than the dates that can currently be attached to any specific site. The meaning has changed as the traditions that interpreted it have changed, as peoples have moved and cultures have evolved and cosmological frameworks have shifted over the long centuries. But the significance of certain places, the significance that keeps showing up in the convergence between anomalous physical features and indigenous oral traditions of importance, that significance has been remarkably persistent. It is that persistence that is perhaps the most interesting thing about the anomalous features beneath Canada's oldest cities. Not the specific features themselves, not the specific dates, or the specific cultural attributions, all of which remain uncertain and contested, but the fact that the places where the features occur are places that have been identified as significant in different ways and by different peoples at different times for as long as the oral traditions can reach. There is something about those places that has kept drawing human attention and human investment, century after century, culture after culture. What that something is, whether it is purely geographical, a function of the specific physical features of the landscape, a good harbour, a defensible position, a resource-rich watershed, or whether it is something else, something that the oral traditions describe in cosmological terms, because that is the framework available to describe things that are real, but not easily categorized in material terms. That question is one of the genuinely open ones. And genuinely open questions, in a subject as rich and strange as this one, deserve to be kept open long enough to be properly investigated. The underground history of Canada is not finished. It is barely begun, in the sense that the investigation has not yet been adequate to the evidence that exists. What has been found, In the fragments and anomalies and footnotes and filed-away reports described in this account is enough to suggest that the story is significantly larger and older than the standard narrative acknowledges. What has not yet been found, because it has not yet been looked for with the tools and the partnerships and the open-ended curiosity that it deserves, is the substance of that larger and older story. It is down there, in the dark beneath Toronto's sidewalks and Victoria's residential foundations and Quebec City's old colonial streets and the prairie substrate of Moose Jaw and the drowned valley of the Peace River and the submerged continental shelf of British Columbia's coast. In the limestone of the Peterborough country and the ancient bedrock of the Shield and the dissolution systems of the Carbonate prairies, in the oral traditions of the nations whose ancestors made it and whose descendants still speak about it in terms that the standard narrative has not been equipped to hear. The investigation that would hear it, that would go down into the dark with the right tools and the right partnerships and the right questions, and come back with an account that is both scientifically rigorous and humanly adequate to the magnitude of what it is describing. That investigation has not yet been done. The ground is waiting, the evidence is waiting. The knowledge that connects the evidence to its context and its meaning is waiting, held by the people who have held it through every disruption and suppression of the past 400 years. What is needed now, what has always been needed, and has taken this long to articulate properly, is the willingness to do the work. To go down into the old and complicated dark of the Canadian landscape and look, carefully and respectfully, and with all the sophistication that the task requires, at what has been left there, at what the ground beneath Canada's oldest cities has been trying, in the patient way of deep geological time, to tell us. The rocks that teach, the Anishinaabe called them at Peterborough, the teaching rocks, they are still teaching, still offering their slow, patient instruction to anyone prepared to listen in the right way, at the right depth, with the right quality of attention. What they are teaching is not a simple lesson. It is not a single clean revelation about who was here and when. It is something more demanding and more rewarding than that. A sustained engagement with the complexity and depth of human presence in this landscape, an engagement that requires everything that the best archaeology and the deepest traditional knowledge and the most patient and careful science can bring to it. The lesson is not finished. The teaching rocks are still at it. And beneath the streets of every major city in Canada, in the limestone and the granite and the carbonate rock and the glacial sediment, in the dark underground spaces that have been there longer than any city above them, the evidence waits, patient, permanent, older than the history we have written for it, and ready to be read. The specific character of the limestone at Peterborough is worth attending to for a moment before the larger story resolves toward its end, because limestone is not an ordinary stone. It is a rock made of ancient life, compressed and consolidated, and chemically altered over millions of years. The accumulated shells and skeletons of marine organisms that lived when the land that is now central Ontario was the floor of a warm, shallow inland sea. To work limestone, to carve into it, or shape it, or inscribe it, is to inscribe into the record of ancient life. The rock that records the 900 carvings at Peterborough was itself, before it was carved, a kind of record, a biological archive of organisms that lived and died and left their physical substance in forms that endured. The act of inscribing into that record, adding human meaning to a surface that already carried geological meaning, was not coincidental. The people who chose this limestone surface, who returned to it over generations to add more marks to its accumulating record, were choosing deliberately, and the deliberateness was connected to what the stone already was, to its nature as a medium that preserved and transmitted information across time. Limestone remembers. It records. It is the stone of memory in a geological sense, and the people who made it into the stone of cultural memory were reading the rock in a way that modern culture has almost entirely forgotten how to read, as a surface that is already inscribed before human hands touch it, already meaningful in ways that human meaning-making works with and within, rather than simply imposing upon. This is not mysticism, it is a different way of knowing the landscape, a way that takes seriously the materiality of the stone and its relationship to deep time, and that allows the human inscriptions to participate in that deep time, rather than simply sitting on top of it. When you carve into limestone that has been there for 400 million years, You are doing something that has a different quality of duration than carving into wood or painting on a wall. The stone was here before any human memory of it, and it will be here long after the last human memory has been lost. What you inscribe into it, you inscribe into geological time, and the humility that implies, the sense of participating in a record that extends both before and after the human, is built into the act. The people at Peterborough understood this. The carvings they added to the limestone were not claims of dominance over the stone or the landscape. They were additions to a record that was already in progress, contributions to a conversation that had been going on since long before humans existed and that would continue long after. The teaching rocks were already teaching before anyone carved into them. The carvings are the human response to the lesson. This perspective, which is available to us through the oral traditions of the Anishinaabe peoples, who have maintained a relationship with the site across the generations, is not separable from the archaeological question of who carved the petroglyphs and when. It is actually essential to the archaeological understanding because it explains why the site is what it is, why it has the characteristics it has, why the carvings are where they are and oriented as they are. The cosmological framework in which the site was created is part of the data, not a supplement to it. And this is the methodological lesson that runs through everything discussed in this account. The evidence of ancient human activity in the Canadian landscape is not interpretable from outside the cultural frameworks in which it was created. Trying to understand what is beneath Toronto without reference to the oral traditions of the Mississaugas and the Haudenosaunee is like trying to read a book in a language you don't know. You might recognize some of the letters, might even guess at some words, but the meaning will elude you because meaning is relational. It emerges from the relationship between physical marks and the system of understanding that those marks presuppose. The system of understanding is not lost. It is held by the nations whose ancestors created the marks, and it is accessible through the patient work of genuine collaboration to anyone willing to do that work respectfully. The underground history of Canada is not, in the end, a mystery to be solved by outsiders with better technologies and more aggressive investigation. It is a conversation to be joined, carefully and humbly, by anyone who has something real to contribute and something real to learn. There is a dream that recurs, in various forms, in the traditions of multiple First Nations across Canada. The dream is of going underground, of entering the earth through a gap in the rock, or a hole in the ground, or a cave mouth that only appears at certain times and in certain conditions, and of finding, in the underground, a world that is parallel to the surface world, but older and more continuous and more fundamentally real. In this underground world, the ancestors are not absent. They are present, carrying on the traditions and the knowledge that have always sustained the people, and they are available to be consulted, to be learned from, to be connected with, in the way that the living always need to be connected with the wisdom of those who came before. This dream, which functions in different cultural contexts as a shamanic journey, a vision quest, a spiritual practice, and a cosmological model, is not purely metaphorical. It is also a map. The underground world of the tradition corresponds to actual underground features in the landscape, actual places where the earth can be entered and where something other than ordinary daily life is encountered. The specific correspondence between the cosmological underground and the physical underground is a knowledge that is held by the people who have maintained the tradition, and it points, when followed, to the places where the physical evidence of ancient human activity is most likely to be found. We are very far, in this kind of knowledge, from what shows up in archaeology textbooks, but we are very close to what the actual evidence, the physical features documented in the construction reports and geological surveys and engineering monographs and self-published pamphlets and academic footnotes that constitute the paper trail of this investigation, what that evidence is actually pointing toward. It is pointing toward places that are cosmologically significant in the traditions of the peoples who created them. It is pointing toward the underground as a domain of human activity that extends back much further than the standard archaeological chronology acknowledges. It is pointing toward a Canada that is significantly older and more complex than the version that gets taught in history classes, and toward a relationship between the land and the people who have lived on it that is, in its depth and continuity, genuinely extraordinary. There is a generation of Canadian archaeologists who are working at the intersection of these different evidential streams, trying to build the methodological framework that would allow the kind of integrated investigation that this subject requires. They are not working in isolation. They are working in partnership with indigenous communities and scholars and knowledge keepers, and they are producing, slowly and carefully, an approach that takes seriously both the physical evidence and the traditional knowledge without reducing either to the other. This work is happening at several universities, in several government heritage agencies, in the research programs of several First Nations whose territories encompass the sites discussed in this account. It is not loud. It is not generating the kind of dramatic headlines that alternative history claims generate. But it is real, and it is progressing. What it will produce over the coming decades is a more accurate and more complete picture of pre-Columbian Canadian history, a picture that is almost certainly stranger and more impressive than both the standard narrative and the alternative history narratives, because it will be built from real evidence investigated with the full range of appropriate tools. The subsurface anomalies will be properly characterized. The oral traditions will be properly understood in their historical depth. The relationship between the physical features and the cultural frameworks in which they were created will be worked out in detail rather than asserted or denied. And the story of who was here and what they were doing, in the deep time before European contact, will become something that can be told accurately rather than guessed at. That story has not yet been told. This account is not it. This account is something more modest, a sketch of the shape of the absence, a mapping of the questions that are waiting for the investigation that will eventually answer them. The absence is real, the questions are real, the evidence that supports them is real, and the investigation is coming, slowly, carefully, with the kind of patience that deep questions deserve. In the meantime, the cities go on. Toronto and Victoria and Quebec City and Moose Jaw and the dozens of other Canadian communities that sit on top of landscapes with 10,000 years or more of human history beneath them, they go on with the ordinary business of being cities. The coffee and the traffic and the meetings and the construction that keeps remaking the surface while the deep layers below remain, largely undisturbed, largely uninvestigated, largely unknown, and beneath the surface, in the dark of the glacial sediment and the limestone formations and the dissolution cavities and the bedrock of the Canadian Shield, the evidence waits, patient as evidence is, permanent as stone is, older than the cities above it, older than the colonial history that shaped those cities, older than the standard narrative that has been used to explain this landscape for the past several centuries, older and still waiting to be understood. The rocks, remember, they are still teaching, and the lesson, the full lesson, is still being learned. At some point in the long project of understanding what is beneath Canada's oldest cities, a researcher is going to find something definitive. Not necessarily something dramatic, not a great stone chamber full of artifacts, not a datable structure that rewrites the textbook chronology in one clean revelation. More likely something modest, a stratigraphic context that places a human-made feature in a sediment layer that dates to a period before the standard chronology acknowledges human presence in that location. A set of lithic artifacts associated with modified bedrock features at a depth and in a matrix that makes their pre-glacial or early post-glacial date unambiguous. A radiocarbon date from organic material sealed in an underground chamber that was not there when the French arrived in Canada. Something small and specific and unambiguous, the kind of evidence that science actually runs on, the kind of evidence that, when it appears, makes the accumulated circumstantial case visible in a new way, the way that finding the keystone of an arch makes visible the structure that the individual stones were always supporting. That piece of evidence is out there somewhere. It has probably been encountered, in fragments, in the various anomalous reports that have been discussed in this account. What it needs is the right context, the right investigation, the right framework for understanding what it is when it is found. The framework is being built by the researchers and the communities working at the intersection described above. The context is accumulating as the body of anomalous evidence grows and the connections between different instances of the pattern become clearer. The investigation that will provide the keystone evidence has not yet been conducted, because the investigation requires institutional will and collaborative trust and funding, and the kind of patient, serious engagement with uncertainty that scientific work at its best requires. It is coming, The underground Canada is not going anywhere. The evidence it contains has been there through 10,000 years, and more of human history playing out on the surface above it, through the advance and retreat of glaciers, through the flooding and draining of post-glacial lakes, through the construction of colonial cities and their subsequent expansion into metropolitan areas that now cover hundreds of square kilometers. It has survived all of that. It will survive the wait for the investigation that is coming. And when that investigation finds what it finds, when the keystone evidence is recovered and analyzed and placed in context and understood, the story it tells will be the story of Canada's true depth of human habitation, a depth that is greater than the current standard narrative acknowledges and more interesting than any alternative history has proposed. It will be a story of the people who were here, doing what people do, marking the landscape and building knowledge and maintaining tradition and going underground when the underground mattered, for longer than any current textbook is prepared to say. That story deserves to be told accurately. It deserves to be investigated rigorously. It deserves to be understood in the full complexity of the evidence, physical and oral and cosmological and geological, that speaks to it from different angles and in different voices, but consistently, stubbornly, in the direction of depth. Canada is older than anyone has been taught to believe. What is beneath its cities is evidence of that age, patient and permanent, and ready, when the right questions are finally asked in the right ways, to answer. This is the story we are building the tools to tell. It is not finished, but it has been waiting, down in the dark, for a very long time, and the waiting is almost over. You are somewhere right now, lying in the dark or sitting in the quiet, and you have travelled with this account, from the ground beneath Toronto's streets, to the limestone of Peterborough, to the drowned coastlines of British Columbia, to the prairie substrate of Saskatchewan, to the rock above the St. Lawrence. You have been beneath cities and inside geological formations and at the margins of academic frameworks that are straining against the weight of evidence they were not built to contain. You have been in the company of retired engineers and elderly geologists and utility workers and knowledge keepers and researchers who are doing quietly and carefully the most important work that can be done in the study of Canadian pre-Columbian history. If any of this has kept you curious, kept you company in the dark hours, kept you thinking about the ground under the city you live in, or the landscape your own tradition comes from, then it has done what it was meant to do. These stories are for the late hours, for the time when the business of the day has gone quiet, and the mind is free to go somewhere further and deeper than the ordinary waking hours allow. They are for the long contemplation of time and place, and the always unfinished work of understanding where we come from and what was here before us. If you want to keep going, keep company with the old and the underground and the patiently unanswered, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next time we go somewhere like this. You can leave a comment, tell me where you are and what time it is. Tell me what in this account made you most curious or what you want to know more about. The comments are where this conversation continues, where the people who have been listening from Vancouver and Halifax and Saskatoon and Montreal and places in between can find each other in the dark and compare notes on what they know about the ground beneath their own cities. If you want to support this work in a more direct way, there is the option of channel membership, which helps fund the time it takes to go into the historical and geological and ethnological material that these accounts require. It is completely optional. Listening and wondering and letting the questions stay open are already exactly what this is for. But before you sleep, before the images of limestone and underground chambers and drowned coastlines and ancient oral traditions settle into whatever your dreaming mind makes of them, let me leave you with this. The most significant thing about the anomalous features beneath Canada's oldest cities is not what they prove, or what they suggest, or what they challenge in the existing narrative. The most significant thing is that they are there at all. That the ground under the ordinary surface of ordinary life in ordinary Canadian cities contains, preserved in stone and sediment, the traces of human presence and human intention from a time so deep that it resists the ordinary categories of history. That the ground remembers, that the rock teaches, that the dark beneath the city is not empty, that something was here before the city and before the colony and before the last ice age, and that what was here left marks that persist, patient and permanent, and waiting for the understanding they deserve. The marks are there, the teaching rocks are still at it, and the lesson, the full and extraordinary and still largely unknown lesson is still being taught to anyone willing to go into the dark and listen. Rest now. The ground beneath you has been here longer than you know. It has held every sleeper who came before you in this place, and it will hold every sleeper who comes after. You are part of a continuity that the rocks measure in thousands of years, and the glaciers measure in tens of thousands, and the Precambrian shield measures in billions, and all of those timescales are real. And all of them encompass you, lying in the ordinary dark of your ordinary room, on top of the oldest story there is, the story of what the ground knows, and what it is still, patiently, trying to teach. Sleep well. The rocks are watching. They have been watching for a very long time, and they will be watching long after the last question about what is beneath them has been finally, fully answered. There is a particular quality of light in northern Ontario in late August that has no equivalent anywhere else in the world. The lakes are low from summer heat, and the exposed rock shelves glow amber and rose and pale grey in the long horizontal light of late afternoon. The shield is visible in a way it is not in other seasons, the bones of the landscape showing through the thin skin of boreal forest and muskeg. If you are in a canoe on one of those lakes in that light, looking at a cliff face where red ochre paintings are still dimly visible despite 10,000 years of weather, you understand something about time that is almost impossible to understand any other way. You understand that the cliff was there before the paintings and will be there after they have faded entirely. You understand that the people who made the paintings understood this too and made them anyway, because the act of making had meaning in itself, independent of the duration of the result. This is what it means to live in geological time rather than human time. Most of us, most of the time, live in human time, the time of hours and days and years and decades, the time that clocks measure and calendars organize and anniversaries mark. Human time is the time of our own personal histories and the histories of our families and communities, the time in which we can trace causes to effects and decisions to consequences, and understand the world as something that human choices shape and human actions populate. Geological time is different in kind, not just in scale. In geological time, human choices are not the primary causative agents. The glaciers advance because of orbital dynamics and atmospheric chemistry and ocean circulation patterns, not because of anything humans decide or do. The limestone erodes because of rainfall chemistry and temperature cycling, processes governed by physics and chemistry that predate life on Earth. The land rises from the removal of the ice's weight at rates too slow to perceive across any human lifetime, driven by the viscous flow of the mantle beneath the crust, a process that was underway before there were eyes to observe it. Living in geological time does not mean ignoring human time. It means holding both simultaneously, understanding the human story as happening within a larger story that does not begin with humans and will not end with them. The teaching rocks of Peterborough are an expression of this dual time, existing simultaneously in the human time of their cultural significance and in the geological time of the limestone that carries them. To understand them properly, you need both scales. What does the geological time of the Canadian landscape tell us about the possibility of very ancient human habitation? It tells us that the conditions for habitation have been present in various parts of the country for much longer than the established archaeological chronology acknowledges as occupied. The warming that followed the Wisconsin glaciation was not a single event. It was a long, irregular process that created habitable conditions in some parts of Canada considerably earlier than in others. The coastal margins, the areas south of the ice, the elevated refugia, all became available at different times. And the timescale on which habitation can develop, from initial exploration of a landscape to the establishment of the kind of dense settlement patterns that leave rich archaeological records, is measured in millennia. If people began exploring the deglaciated margins of Canada 15,000 years ago, by the time the standard archaeological chronology begins to see them clearly in the material record, 12 to 13,000 years ago, they had already been in the landscape for several thousand years. What were they doing in those first several thousand years? Moving through the landscape, learning it, establishing the ecological knowledge and the territorial patterns that would support later and more visible cultural development, making camps that left few durable traces, beginning the long process of building the relationship with the landscape that, 10,000 years later, would produce the petroglyphs of Peterborough and the stone structures of Churchill, and whatever is beneath the streets of Toronto. The standard narrative tends to present the early post-glacial period as a time of simple wandering, of people moving through an empty landscape without yet knowing where they were going or what they were doing. This presentation is shaped more by the limitations of the archaeological record than by the actual character of early post-glacial life. The people who moved into the deglaciated Canadian landscape were not blank slates. They came from somewhere, with technologies and social organizations and knowledge systems appropriate to their origins, and they were adapting those systems to a new landscape in the systematic, intelligent way that humans have always adapted to new environments. The landscape they were adapting to was, in the first several thousand years after deglaciation, one of the most rapidly changing environments in the history of the continent. The climate was warming, the vegetation was shifting northward, the lakes were rising and falling as the meltwater hydrology sorted itself out. The rivers were cutting new channels and abandoning old ones. The coastlines were changing as sea levels rose, and the land itself rose in response to the removal of the ice's weight. This was not a stable landscape. It was a landscape in motion, and the people adapting to it needed to be adaptable to maintain the capacity for rapid adjustment that their ancestors had developed over thousands of years of life at the margins of the great ice sheets. What the anomalous features beneath Canada's cities may represent is the trace of this early adaptive process, the physical evidence of people learning to use the landscape in ways appropriate to its specific conditions. The underground chambers may be cold storage, taking advantage of the stable, cool temperatures below the frost line to preserve food through the warm season. The subsurface passages may be connections between surface features whose significance was environmental or cosmological or both. The astronomical alignments may be the physical record of the calendrical knowledge that made it possible to anticipate the landscape's seasonal changes and plan for them rather than simply reacting to them. None of this is certain. All of it is plausible, consistent with what the available evidence shows, consistent with what is known about human behavioral adaptations to post-glacial environments in other parts of the world, consistent with the oral traditions of the nations whose ancestors were here. It is plausible enough to deserve investigation, and the investigation would not require the abandonment of any currently established framework. It would require the extension of that framework backward in time, into the early post-glacial period that the available evidence is beginning to show was more populated and more culturally complex than the standard narrative has acknowledged. There is a specific conversation that has been taking place in the literature of Canadian historical archaeology for the past 2 decades that bears directly on this question. The conversation is about what archaeologists call threshold events in cultural evolution, the moments when a population crosses from one level of social and technological organization to a significantly higher level. The transition from mobile foraging to semi-sedentary settlement is one such threshold. The development of formal ceremonial sites that drew people from across a wide territory is another. The creation of structured trade networks that moved specific materials, particularly high-quality tool stones like obsidian and flint and chert, over long distances is a third. These threshold events, in the established framework for Canadian pre-Columbian history, are placed in the late Archaic and early woodland periods, roughly 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. This is when the evidence for regional trade networks, for elaborate burial practices, for ceremonial sites drawing wide populations, becomes clear and consistent in the archaeological record. Before this threshold, the framework says, Canadian populations were smaller and less organizationally complex. Mobile foragers without the social structures required for large-scale cooperative projects. But the threshold events recorded in the late Archaic and woodland periods do not come from nowhere. They presuppose exactly the kind of deep ecological knowledge, the extensive territorial familiarity, the intergroup communication networks, and the cumulative technical knowledge that develops over thousands of years of continuous occupation. The cultural complexity of the woodland period Hopewell Exchange Network, which distributed specific high-prestige materials across an area spanning from the Gulf of Mexico to Lake Superior, was not built in a generation. It was built on foundations laid over the preceding millennia of gradually deepening human engagement with the North American landscape. What happens if you push the threshold events back a few thousand years? What if the organizational complexity that shows up clearly in the material record 3,000 years ago was already present? in less visible forms, 5 or 6 or 7,000 years ago. The physical evidence is consistent with this earlier timeline in several respects. The astronomical knowledge implied by the Peterborough site, by the Peace River high-altitude markers, by the stone features at Churchill, is the kind of knowledge that develops over multiple generations of systematic observation. The social organization implied by the construction of elaborate underground spaces is the kind of organization that develops over generations of cooperative experience. These things take time, and time means earlier origins than the currently documented record shows. The researcher who has written most clearly about this question of threshold event timing in Canadian archaeology is a scholar at a Canadian university who has spent 30 years working in the Shield country of Northern Ontario, conducting survey and excavation at sites spanning the full range of the established cultural chronology. Her work, published in a series of papers that are accessible through standard academic databases and that are beginning to attract the broader attention they deserve, argues that the evidence for organizational complexity in the Canadian Shield country is significantly older than the standard framework acknowledges, and that the apparent threshold event visible in the material record around 3,000 years ago is not the beginning of complexity, but its first clearly visible expression in durable material culture. Her argument is framed carefully and supported by a substantial body of evidence from the sites she has been working in for 3 decades, and it is beginning to gain traction in the academic conversation about pre-Columbian Canadian history. It does not by itself resolve the questions raised by the anomalous subsurface features in Canada's cities, but it provides a scholarly framework in which those features are not simply anomalous, in which they can be understood as part of a pattern of human cultural development that is older and more gradual than the standard framework suggests. The pattern, when all the evidence is laid out together, is one of depth. Depth in time, depth in organizational complexity, depth in the relationship between the people and the landscape. Canada's pre-Columbian history is not a simple story, with a clean beginning at the Clovis threshold and a steady linear development from there. It is a deep story, a story measured in geological rather than human time, a story of people who were here long enough to develop the intimate, sophisticated, multi-generational relationship with the land that produced the teaching rocks and the underground chambers and the astronomical alignments and the oral traditions that still speak to those who listen carefully about what the ground beneath Canada's cities contains and what it means. The depth of that story is what the anomalous features are pointing toward. Not a lost civilization in the sensational sense, not a discovery that will rewrite everything overnight, but a genuine historical depth that has been systematically underestimated because the tools and the frameworks for seeing it have not been adequate to the task. The tools are improving, the frameworks are changing, the partnerships that make the deepest investigation possible are being built, slowly and carefully. Between the institutional archaeology that has the technical capacity and the indigenous communities that have the traditional knowledge and the territorial relationship that makes the investigation legitimate and meaningful. The convergence of these factors, improved tools and changing frameworks and new partnerships, is producing a shift in Canadian historical archaeology that is not yet visible in popular accounts of Canadian history, but that is happening steadily and irreversibly. In the research literature, the shift is toward a deeper chronology, a more complex picture, a fuller acknowledgement of what was here before European contact, and the specific question of what is beneath Canada's oldest cities, the specific anomalous features and their potential relationship to a longer and more complex human history, is one of the places where that shift is most urgently needed and most likely, eventually, to produce genuine new knowledge. The underground is patient. The questions it holds have waited through 10,000 years of human history on the surface above it. They can wait a while longer, but not indefinitely. The cities are expanding, the construction is ongoing, the subsurface is being disturbed on a regular basis in the course of ordinary urban development. Each time, a foundation is poured, or a utility trench is cut, or a transit tunnel is bored, potential evidence is either recovered if someone is paying attention, or destroyed if someone is not. The window for recovery is narrower than it has ever been, as the cities grow denser and the depths of their subsurface infrastructure increase. This is the urgency behind the academic conversation described above, the urgency behind the community heritage projects and the archaeological monitoring programs, and the collaboration between indigenous communities and municipal heritage offices that are working, with insufficient resources and insufficient coordination, to ensure that what the ground contains is not lost before it can be properly understood. The urgency is real, the window is closing, and the story that is waiting in the dark beneath Canada's oldest cities is worth preserving, worth investigating, worth the patient and respectful and scientifically rigorous work that it deserves. That work begins with knowing that there is something to look for. It begins with taking seriously the accumulated evidence, the anomalous reports, and the engineering footnotes, and the self-published monographs, and the oral traditions that consistently point toward a deeper and more complex human history in the Canadian landscape than the standard narrative acknowledges. It begins with the willingness to ask the question that the evidence demands, the question that has been waiting with the patient permanence of stone for someone to ask it properly. What is beneath these cities? The ground has always known. The rocks have always been teaching. The question is whether we are finally ready to listen. In the northern interior of British Columbia, there is a lake that is not named on most maps, a lake that local Indigenous knowledge keepers have described as a place of unusual historical significance, a place where the ground around the lake shows evidence of modification that predates any known cultural tradition in the region. Researchers who have visited the site describe a shoreline on which the bedrock shows regular, widely spaced features that they interpret, cautiously, as prepared surfaces, flat-topped protrusions of the bedrock at intervals that suggest deliberate spacing rather than natural erosion patterns. The features are old. The weathering on their surfaces is consistent with a date significantly before the established cultural sequence for the region. The lake itself sits in a basin that would have been accessible, unlike much of the surrounding terrain, through the period of glacial advance, a geography that protected it from the worst effects of glaciation while keeping it connected to the resource base of the surrounding mountains. No formal archaeological investigation of this lake has been conducted. The Indigenous knowledge keepers who identified it as significant have not been invited to collaborate in any research program focused on the site. The researchers who have visited it did so informally, without the institutional backing that would allow their observations to be published in forms that reach the academic conversation. The site waits, as all the sites in this account wait, for the investigation that would determine what it is and what it means. But it is there, and it's being there, unnamed on the maps, known to the people who have always known these mountains, accumulating in the company of all the other anomalous sites and unexplained features and architectural mysteries that constitute the underground evidence of pre-Columbian Canada, is itself a kind of answer to the question this account has been asking. The answer is that we do not yet know what we have. We do not yet know the full scope and character of the human history embedded in the Canadian landscape, because we have not yet looked carefully enough, in the right places, with the right tools and the right partners, and the right openness to finding something we did not expect. The not yet knowing is not a failure. It is a condition, a temporary state of incomplete knowledge that is in the process of being addressed by the work described above. The knowledge will come, the story will be told more fully and more accurately than it has been told before, and the telling will include, when it happens, the voice of the ground itself, the patient and permanent voice of the stone that has been holding the evidence for 10,000 years or more, waiting for the right questions to be finally asked of it. Ask the ground, listen to the rock. Take seriously the testimony of the people who have been in relationship with this landscape since before any of these cities existed. That is where the story is. That is where it has always been. And that, in the end, is the only place it was ever going to be found. The mysteries that endure in Canadian pre-Columbian history are not mysteries because they are inherently unsolvable. They are mysteries because the investigation has not yet been adequate to the evidence. Adequacy requires resources, partnerships, openness, and time. All of these are available if the will to provide them can be found. The will, too, is available in the communities that have been asking these questions for generations, and in the researchers who are beginning to ask them with the full technical capacity of contemporary science. The convergence of these two sources of will traditional and academic, is the thing that will finally make the investigation adequate to the evidence. When that investigation happens, when the keystone evidence is found, and the story is told in its full depth, what will the cities look like then? Not different on the surface, not immediately. The coffee shops will still be there, the traffic will still flow. The residents will still go about the ordinary business of their ordinary days. But beneath the surface, in the understanding that people carry about the place they live in, something will have shifted. The knowledge that the ground beneath this city is older than the city, older than the colonial history that shaped the city, older than any currently established cultural tradition in the area, that knowledge will be present in the understanding of the place in a new way. And that new way of understanding will connect, inevitably and appropriately, to the living knowledge of the nations whose ancestors created what is beneath the cities. The connection between the physical evidence and the oral tradition will be explicit rather than implicit, acknowledged rather than ignored, and the result will be a richer and more accurate account of Canadian history than has previously been available. Not just the history of the last 500 years, but the history of the full human presence in this landscape. All 10,000 or 20,000 or however many thousand years of it turn out to be documented when the investigation has finally been done. That history will be Canada's most important historical discovery since the excavation of the first Clovis sites established that humans were in the Americas before written records. It will be more specifically Canadian than that discovery, rooted in the specific geology and ecology and cultural traditions of this specific territory. And it will be a discovery that was always waiting in the ground, patient and permanent, needing only the right investigation to be brought into the light. The light is coming, the investigation is underway. The ground is ready, as it has always been, to give up what it knows to anyone patient and respectful and skilled enough to ask. Stay curious, the rocks are still teaching, and the lesson, the full lesson, is almost ready to be heard. Let us go somewhere that has not yet been discussed in this account, somewhere that complicates the picture in a specific and interesting way. The Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick is one of the most geologically dramatic environments in Canada, a place where the tidal range reaches 15 meters, where twice a day the ocean floor is exposed for miles and then submerged again, where the geological record of sea level change over the post-glacial period is particularly well preserved because of the specific dynamics of this coastal system. The Bay of Fundy has been studied by marine geologists in considerable detail, and the picture that emerges from that study is one of dramatic environmental change over the past 12,000 years, change that would have had profound effects on any human populations living in the area. At the time of the glacial maximum, the Bay of Fundy did not exist in its current form. The lower sea levels of the glacial period meant that much of what is now the floor of the bay was dry land, a broad valley carved by a river system that drained southward into an ocean that was far to the east of its current position. The land that is now underwater between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick was 12 to 15,000 years ago, a productive coastal plain with rivers and forests and the full range of plant and animal communities that characterize the temperate coastal zones of eastern North America. People living on this coastal plain would have had access to terrestrial resources from the upland areas and marine resources from the coastline to the south, an extremely productive ecological combination. When the ice melted and the sea level rose, this coastal plain was inundated, slowly, over centuries, by the encroaching ocean. The rate of inundation was not constant. It was affected by local variations in the rate of glacial retreat and by the isostatic rebound of the land, as the ice's weight was removed, and the specific timing and pattern of the inundation in the Bay of Fundy area has been the subject of careful geological work. What the geological work shows is that the inundation of the bay took several thousand years, from the initial incursion of marine waters around 12,000 years ago to the establishment of something approximating the current bay configuration around 6,000 years ago. During those 6,000 years of inundation, the coastal plain that had been inhabited during the glacial maximum was progressively submerged, and any archaeological sites on that plain were covered by the rising waters. Those sites are now under 15 to 20 meters of water in some parts of the bay, and the archaeological investigation of submerged sites in these conditions is technically challenging, but not impossible. The tidal exposure that makes the Bay of Fundy famous for its dramatic scenery also periodically exposes portions of the drowned landscape, and researchers have identified, in the exposed peat layers and clay sediments of the bay floor during extreme low tides, evidence of the terrestrial landscape that was there before the ocean arrived. The evidence found in these exposures includes, most dramatically, the stumps of ancient forests drowned by the rising sea, the fossil soils that preserve the chemical signatures of the plants and animals that lived on them, and in several locations, features in the peat layer that have been interpreted by the researchers who documented them as evidence of human activity. The interpretation is cautious. The features are ambiguous, not cleanly attributable to human action rather than natural processes. But they are present, and they are old, dating to the period before the bay existed, to the time when that drowned coastal plain was dry land and potentially inhabited. The Mi'kmaq peoples of the maritime provinces have oral traditions that describe the Bay of Fundy area in terms consistent with the geological evidence of the pre-inundation coastal plain. They describe an ancestor world in which the landscape was different, in which the sea was further away and the land was broader and more various than it is now, a world that was changed by a great event, a flooding or a catastrophe that altered the geography and required the ancestors to adapt. This tradition, in its general character, matches the geological story of the bay's formation, and this match has been noted by researchers working at the intersection of Mi'kmaq oral tradition and Bay of Fundy geology. What has not been noted, or at least not published in accessible form, is whether the specific locations described in Mi'kmaq traditions as sites of ancestral significance correspond to the locations where the submerged archaeological features have been identified in the bay's exposed sediments. This correspondence, if it exists, would be exactly the kind of convergence between oral tradition and physical evidence that provides the most persuasive basis for further investigation. Whether it exists or not, the possibility of investigating it has not been actively pursued in the research literature. The Bay of Fundy is not beneath a city, but the story of what it contains tells us something important about the character of the evidence for pre-Columbian Canadian history across the country as a whole. The evidence is often underwater, often underground, often below the level at which normal archaeological survey operates. It is often in places that have been altered so dramatically by post-glacial environmental change that the sites are separated from the landscape in which they were created, embedded in geological contexts that no longer reflect the conditions under which they were made. And it is often documented in partial and fragmented ways that make the accumulation of evidence toward a coherent picture slow and difficult. The picture is accumulating, nonetheless. Each piece of evidence that is properly documented and placed in context, each anomalous feature that is characterized precisely enough to be compared with similar features elsewhere, each oral tradition that is recorded and analyzed in its historical dimensions, rather than simply as cultural expression, adds to the picture. The picture is incomplete. It will be incomplete for a long time yet, but it is becoming less incomplete with each generation of research, and the direction in which it is developing is clear. It is developing in the direction of greater depth, greater complexity, and greater antiquity than the standard narrative has been willing to acknowledge. The Canadian landscape is, in the deepest sense, a record. The rock records the deep time of geological process. The glacial sediments record the Pleistocene ice ages. The post-glacial lake beds and river deposits record the dynamic environmental changes of the early Holocene. And embedded in all of these geological layers, at various depths and in various states of preservation, the human record is also there. The material traces of the people who were in this landscape during all of those periods, adapting to the conditions of each successive era, maintaining the traditions and the knowledge and the territorial relationships that connected them to this land across the full span of its post-glacial history. Reading that record requires all the tools of contemporary geology, geophysics, physical anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, and traditional knowledge. No single tool is sufficient. No single discipline can see what the full range of evidence shows. The investigation that will finally read the record adequately will be interdisciplinary in the broadest sense, integrating knowledge from fields that do not normally communicate with each other, and it will be collaborative in the deepest sense, drawing on the knowledge and the partnership of the nations whose ancestors created the record and whose traditions still speak to its content. This is a vision of how the investigation should proceed, and it is also a description of how it is, in some places and in some research programs, beginning to proceed. The beginning is fragile and incomplete and underfunded, but it is happening, and the trajectory it describes is toward the kind of research that this subject deserves and that the evidence demands. When the research has been done, when the investigation has finally been adequate to the evidence, what will the story be? Not the whole story, because the whole story is too large and too complex and too ancient to be told in any single account. But the beginning of the story, the part that the current evidence is pointing toward, the part that the oral traditions and the geological surveys and the construction reports and the geophysical anomalies all seem to be saying something about, that part is becoming visible enough to sketch. It is a story of people in Canada over a very long time. People who came to this landscape when the ice was retreating, who followed the resources northward as the climate warmed and the land opened, who found in this vast and varied territory the conditions for a life that was, in most respects, a good life, resourceful and culturally rich, and deeply embedded in the specific ecology of specific places. Those people developed, over thousands of years, the knowledge systems and social organizations and territorial relationships that allowed them to live well in one of the most challenging sets of environments on Earth. From the Arctic coast to the Pacific rainforest, to the boreal shield, to the temperate Great Lakes basin, to the prairie grasslands, to the Atlantic maritime coast. In the process of living well over thousands of years, those people marked the landscape. They carved into limestone and granite. They built with stone in ways that used the natural formations of the landscape as foundations and armatures. They went underground when the underground was useful or sacred or both. They aligned their constructions with astronomical phenomena because astronomical knowledge was practically important, allowing them to anticipate seasonal changes and plan for them. They created trade networks that moved materials across thousands of kilometers and distributed knowledge along with the materials. And they embedded all of this, the knowledge and the territorial relationships and the cosmological frameworks that gave them meaning, in oral traditions that have survived, in modified forms, into the present. The physical traces of all this human activity are not absent from the Canadian landscape. They are present in the anomalous features described in this account, and in the many other anomalous features that have not been discussed here, because they have not been adequately documented, and because this account is already as long as its subject requires. The traces are there. What has been lacking is the investigation that would characterize them properly and place them in the context of the full, deep human history of this landscape. That investigation, the investigation that Canada's underground pre-Columbian history deserves, is the task that the evidence is pointing toward. It is the task that the oral traditions of the nations who created the evidence are pointing toward. It is the task that the geological surveys and the engineering reports and the geophysical anomalies are pointing toward, in their different and fragmentary ways. It is, in the end, the task that anyone who has listened to this account and found themselves genuinely curious about what is beneath Canada's oldest cities is pointing toward. In the particular way that genuine curiosity always points toward more and better knowledge, toward the investigation that would replace uncertainty with understanding, without destroying the mystery that makes the uncertainty interesting. The mystery is real. The evidence is real. The investigation is needed. And the knowledge that the investigation will produce when it finally comes will be worth the wait. Stay with the questions. They are taking us somewhere. Not far now, just deeper. The last thing to be said about the underground history of Canada, the thing that does not fit neatly into any of the categories discussed so far, but that is nevertheless part of the full picture, is this. The anomalous features described in this account are not the only anomalies in the Canadian pre-Columbian record. They are not even the most dramatic. They are simply the ones that have been best documented, that have accumulated enough of a paper trail to be traced and described with some specificity. There are other anomalies, less well documented, some known only from single accounts by single witnesses, some documented but not published in accessible form, some still entirely unknown to anyone outside the specific localities where they are located. The existence of these other anomalies the ones this account has not been able to describe because the documentation is insufficient or inaccessible, is suggested by the pattern of the anomalies that have been described. The pattern, once you see it, is recognizable as the surface expression of something more extensive that lies below it. The pattern is too consistent, appearing in too many different cities, and too many different geological contexts, and too many different types of evidence, to be the result of random accumulation. It is the pattern of something real, something that extends beyond the specific sites described here, to encompass a broader and more complex archaeological reality that the standard narrative has not yet been able to see. That broader archaeological reality is what this account has been trying to point toward through the specific evidence of specific sites across the varied geological and cultural landscape of the Canadian territory. It is not fully visible yet. It will not be fully visible until the investigation has been done, but the shape of it is discernible in the pattern of what has already been found, and that shape is the shape of depth of a human presence in this landscape that is significantly older and more complex than the standard narrative acknowledges. The ground beneath Canada's oldest cities holds that depth. It has always held it. And the question of what it contains, the full answer to the question that this account has been posing, is the most important unanswered question in Canadian historical science. Not because the answer will be spectacular, though it may be. Not because it will rewrite the textbooks overnight, though it will change them eventually. But because the answer will give Canada back a portion of its own history that has been lost, not maliciously, but through the ordinary structural limitations of a narrative framework built from insufficient evidence. And that portion of its history is the longest and deepest and in many ways the most significant part. The people who were here before the cities, who are the ancestors of the nations that the cities were built on top of, were doing important things for a very long time. The evidence of those important things is in the ground beneath the cities. Finding it, understanding it, telling the story it contains accurately and completely is the work that remains to be done. And it will be done. The tools exist, the partnerships are being built. The oral traditions are available to anyone who approaches them with the right respect and the right questions. The geological and geophysical methods that can characterize subsurface features without destroying them are improving rapidly. The academic and institutional frameworks for Indigenous-led and co-led research are strengthening. Everything needed for the investigation exists or is being developed. What remains is to begin. To go into the dark beneath Canada's oldest cities with all the care and capability and partnership that the task requires, and to find there what the evidence has been saying for a very long time is waiting to be found. The rocks, remember, they are still teaching. The lesson has been going on for 10,000 years or more, and it is still in progress. We are still students in it, all of us, whatever our specific relationship to the land and its history, and the most important thing a student can do is stay curious, stay humble, and keep listening. The ground is patient. It will keep teaching for as long as anyone is willing to learn. And you, lying in the dark wherever you are right now, with this account settling into whatever the sleeping mind makes of long stories about old ground, you are part of that continuity. Your curiosity about what is beneath Canada's cities, your willingness to spend the quiet hours in company with the questions these anomalous features raise, connects you to the long human tradition of caring about this land and wondering about its history. That tradition goes back further than any specific cultural attribution, further than the established archaeological chronology, back to the first people who looked at the limestone outcrop, or the underground chamber, or the astronomical alignment, and thought, someone did this, and what it meant was important to them, and I want to understand what it was. That thought, recurring across generations and across cultures and across the full span of human presence in this landscape, is the beginning of all the understanding that has followed, and all the understanding that is still to come. It is the beginning of the investigation. And it starts, as all investigations do, with the willingness to notice that something is there, to let the fact of its presence raise the question of its origin, and to take the question seriously enough to pursue it wherever it leads. Wherever it leads, in this case, is down, into the ground, into the dark of the Canadian underground, where the evidence is waiting, where the rocks are teaching, where the story of who was here and what they did, and how long they were doing it, is preserved in the patient, permanent way of stone, and where the investigation that will finally read that story properly is still, for now, waiting to be done. When you wake, the ground will still be there beneath you. The cities will still be above what they were built on. And somewhere between the surface and the deep geological time below it, in the layers of sediment and bedrock and human modification and geological process, the mystery of Canada's oldest inhabitants will still be waiting, patient, as always, for the questions that will finally bring it into the light. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the long investigation continues. There is one more place in this account that deserves attention before the close. A place that has been circling at the edge of the narrative since the beginning, but that has not yet been directly addressed. That place is Winnipeg, Manitoba, and specifically the area around the confluence of the Red River and the Assiniboine River that forms the geographic and historical heart of the city. Winnipeg sits at what is called the Forks, the junction of these two rivers, and the Forks has been the most intensively inhabited location in the Manitoba interior for the better part of 10,000 years. We know this because the Forks archaeological site, now a National Historic Site of Canada, has been extensively excavated and has produced a stratigraphic record of human occupation reaching back 6,000 years at the most recent scholarly estimate, with earlier cultural horizons suggested by the depth of the deposits, but not yet adequately characterized. The site is genuine, well documented, and represents one of the richest archaeological records in the Prairie provinces. What the standard interpretation of the site presents is a succession of different cultural groups, each occupying the same strategic location at the confluence of the two rivers, each leaving distinctive material culture in the accumulating sediment layers. The whole sequence telling a story of cultural continuity and change across the post-glacial prairies. What the standard interpretation does not fully address is why this specific location has been continuously attractive for human settlement for 6,000 years. The answer that is usually given, that the confluence of two major rivers provides a strategic transportation hub and a rich resource base, is correct as far as it goes. But it does not fully explain the evidence of continuous occupation, because continuous occupation in any single location requires more than strategic advantage. It requires the maintenance of social and cultural frameworks that make continuous return to the location meaningful, and those frameworks have to be transmitted across generations without interruption. 6,000 years of uninterrupted cultural continuity at a single location, even a strategically important one, is remarkable. It implies a relationship between the people and the place that goes beyond simple opportunism, beyond the rational calculation of resource access and transportation advantage. It implies the kind of territorial commitment and landscape identity that develops over very long periods of intimate occupation, the kind of relationship that is expressed in the oral traditions of the peoples who have maintained this site across those thousands of years. Those peoples are the Anishinaabe and the Nakota and the Cree nations, whose traditional territories encompass the Forks area and whose oral traditions describe this confluence as a place of deep significance, a meeting point not only of rivers, but of peoples and traditions. The significance is both practical, it is indeed a meeting point of major transportation routes, and cosmological, it is a place where the two rivers speak to each other in ways that have spiritual as well as geographical meaning. Beneath the 6,000-year record of the Forks site, at depths that the current excavations have not reached, the geological record shows the sediments deposited by an even earlier landscape, the bed of glacial Lake Agassiz, one of the largest post-glacial lakes in North America, which occupied the Manitoba Basin in the period immediately following the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet. Lake Agassiz was, at its maximum extent, larger than all the current Great Lakes combined, a vast inland sea of glacial meltwater that covered much of present-day Manitoba, Ontario, and Saskatchewan for several thousand years before finding outlets to the north and eventually draining. The drainage of Lake Agassiz was a catastrophic event by human standards, though slow by geological ones. As the ice margin retreated to expose new outlets, the lake level dropped dramatically over periods of decades and centuries, exposing vast areas of former lake bed and creating the landscape of the Manitoba Basin as it exists today. The sediments deposited in this drainage event, the silts and clays and sands that settled from the lake's waters over thousands of years, are the parent material of the incredibly fertile soils of the Red River Valley, the soils that made this region one of the most productive agricultural areas in Canada, when European settlers arrived in the 19th century. But those sediments also sealed whatever was on the lakebed before and during the lake's existence. If there were structures or features created on the margins of Lake Agassiz during its occupation, features left by the people who lived around the lake's shores during its thousands of years of existence, those features are now under the lake sediments, buried beneath the flat, fertile soils of the Manitoba Basin. Were there people around the shores of Lake Agassiz? Almost certainly. The lake was a massive ecological resource, and post-glacial lakes of this scale attracted human population. The Paleo-Indian cultures that are documented in the Manitoba record in the early post-glacial period were living at the margins of the retreating ice and the expanding lake, and the material culture they left is found in locations consistent with occupation of the lake's shores. But the shore locations that were most intensively occupied in the early post-glacial period are now, in most cases, under the sediment that accumulated as the lake drained and the basin settled. Finding them would require penetrating below the Lake Agassiz sediments to depths that typical archaeological survey does not reach. The Fork site represents, in this geological context, the top of a buried sequence that almost certainly extends much deeper than current excavations have gone. The 6,000-year record is the visible tip of a history that goes back to the very beginning of post-glacial occupation of the Manitoba Basin. And what is in the deeper layers, what the Lake Agassiz sediments are hiding below the surface of the Forks National Historic Site, is one of the most potentially significant questions in prairie archaeology. No one has looked. The technical challenge of excavating below Lake Agassiz sediments to reach pre-lake cultural horizons is substantial. The cost of such an excavation in an urban context, in the middle of what is now a major tourist attraction and a densely developed urban core, is prohibitive without specific funding directed toward this specific question. And the existing research frameworks are not structured to ask this specific question because the existing frameworks do not presuppose the existence of significant cultural material below the Lake Agassiz sediments at this location. But the question deserves to be asked. The geological context makes it plausible. The oral traditions of the peoples who have occupied this location for 6,000 years and more, traditions that describe its significance in ways that suggest a much longer period of meaningful relationship with the place than the documented archaeological record shows, support the plausibility and the pattern of the evidence across this account. The consistent finding of anomalous features at greater depth than expected at locations identified in indigenous traditions as places of deep significance. That pattern supports it as well. Ask the Forks what it knows. Go deeper than the Lake Agassiz sediments. Find what is in the pre-lake layers, below the floor of the glacial sea that once covered this basin. The evidence is there if you look for it. The traditions say it is there. The geology does not exclude it. And the story it would tell, the story of who was at the confluence of these rivers before the lake covered them and what they were doing there, is a story that belongs in the full account of Canadian pre-Columbian history. It has been waiting, under the lake sediments, for the right question to finally be asked of it. All of it is waiting. All the deep questions, all the buried evidence, all the oral traditions that connect the living present to the ancient past, all the anomalous features in the limestone and the granite and the glacial sediment and the carbonate rock of the prairie substrate, all of it is waiting, patient as stone is patient, for the investigation that will finally be adequate to it. And somewhere, tonight, beneath whatever city or town or rural landscape you are in, beneath the ordinary surface of the ordinary world, the ground is holding its own record, its own version of this same deep story, its own evidence of what was here before everything that is here now, waiting, in the dark and the patience of deep geological time, to be read. This is the story of what we don't yet know, and what we don't yet know is vast and strange and worth knowing. The rocks are still teaching. The lesson is still in progress. And the investigation that will finally read what the ground has been trying to say for 10,000 years or more is, at last, beginning to be done. Stay curious. The ground has more to tell us. And so does the dark. The teaching rocks at Peterborough are behind glass now, protected from the weather and from the touch of the hands that would otherwise press against them. The glass is appropriate and necessary. The carvings belong to time in a way that our individual hands cannot be trusted with. But the desire to touch, to feel the connection directly, rather than through mediation and centuries of accumulated distance. That desire is the right desire. It drives the investigation, keeps the questions alive, keeps the evidence from settling into the obscurity of the unanswered. It is what this account has been about, from the first paragraph to this last one. The ground is not finished with us. We are not finished with it. The story continues, deeper than we have yet gone, older than we have yet reached, and the investigation that will finally read what the ground has been trying to say, across all that depth and all that time, is the most important work that remains in our story of what it means to be human.